911 was the emergency. I just heard 5 shots, really loud. Bang, 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 bang.
Is this individual walking around hunting people?
I was angry, just wondering who did it, why.
I just couldn't believe one person can do all that. I was really shocked. He took their lives for nothing.
How do we warn people when anybody could be a victim?
It was a big concern that we would end up with another killing. If this camera was working, it captured the entire case.
Jason Netter is a 41-year-old living a transient lifestyle in Anchorage, Alaska.
Jason was a very kind person. He was outgoing, he was funny. If somebody was in desperate need, he'd give you the shirt off his back. Jason loved being outside. He was like one with the nature. But once he moved to Alaska, I didn't hear from him. He stopped working and was homeless. But my brother Robert contacted him and they talked. Robert told me Jason was really trying to get his stuff together. I was real happy to know that my brother was doing real good.
Jason spends time with his friend, Brianna Foisey.
Hi guys, this is gonna be my first video. I'm kind of scared, a little nervous, but I think I can do this. The first song I'm ever gonna put on my account, yay!
I knew Brianna when I was working in a group home for young ladies. When I think about her, that always makes me smile. She was very bubbly. I always wanted to be friends with people. The last time I saw Brianna, she looked really good. She looked very happy. She loved singing. She had a beautiful voice. She loved writing music and poetry.
So I'm gonna be singing If You Knew by Joel Favier. I think I said his name right, I don't know, but he's one of my favorites here on YouTube, so this one's a tribute to him, I guess.
I could see a budding artist there. Kind of bittersweet thinking about that, but I'm glad that the last time I saw her, she was looking so well and so happy.
911 was the location of your emergency. I am right on the Ship Creek Trail. There are 2 people lying down on the path, and I think they're dead. There's blood coming out of one of their heads. Okay, hold on. Okay. Oh, the guy is definitely dead. And the girl has a bunch of blood streaming out of her.
Anchorage detectives race to the scene.
Ship Creek area is an industrial area in the east part of town. In the early morning hours, you don't see too many people there.
When we got there, there's 2 people, both of them on the trail, and one was a male and one was a female.
Do we know who the victims are?
Both victims had their IDs on them.
Our female victim was Brianna Foisey, and she was age 20. The male victim was Jason Netter, age 41. As I took a look at those folks, I could see, okay, they're still warm. It's not been long since this had all happened.
Patrol should sweep the area.
Both had been shot through their torsos, then both were given headshots. Probably exactly where the gun was aimed. It starts to put a marksmanship kind of a expertise on the shooter. Was the motive to take something from these individuals, money, jewelry, phones, something of value. So we were just trying to determine whether or not they were missing anything. It seemed like a random act of violence that just struck these 2 individuals. And surprisingly enough, there's no shell casings on the ground. We're like, okay, revolver. That's why we don't have any shell casings here. We were able to find a bullet that struck a fence post. And we take that bullet and have it analyzed by a ballistics expert to determine what kind of gun the bullet came out of.
Let's go see what the witness saw.
So our witness that calls the 911, she tells us that she was riding a bicycle across the bridge on the Ship Creek Trail, and she came across a male who says, hey, there's 2 dead bodies on the trail down there, so be careful. Then she goes down the Ship Creek Trail.
She came upon 2 dead people on the trail. She immediately called 911. Why didn't he call 911? Why did he ask somebody else? We didn't know for sure what his role could be, so we couldn't immediately eliminate him.
Can you describe what he looked like?
Unfortunately, she did not take a good look at that individual.
It's a setback, so detectives widen their search for clues.
There weren't any surveillance cameras on the trail. So then we have to try to step out further. We look for cameras that would have captured someone going into where we find the bodies. A block or 2 away, we came across an electric company that is right there next to the trail. On the corner of their building was a camera that faced in the right direction. It was just too far away to capture the killings. But we were hoping that our individual that talked to our 911 caller would come past that camera, and then we would be able to figure out who he is.
Let's queue up just before 7.
The lady finds the people on the trail at about 7:40 a.m.
At this time, really nobody on the streets, no people walking.
Come on, show yourself. Stop. Play it again.
But we do capture an image of a person walking towards the Ship Creek Trail.
Unfortunately, the video was from quite a distance away. It was grainy, but we could see that it was most likely a male.
We see him walking away from the frame towards the trail. At about the same time, that would have taken him past our victims and also to our 911 caller. And I'm just like, this is our guy. We slow it down frame by frame. We need to see what the individual looks like.
It was frustrating that you couldn't see the face.
Detectives look closer for anything that could reveal this man's identity.
He's a tall individual. He's wearing a bulky jacket and a tan backpack and a hoodie or a hat over his head.
There was hope that this would be the breakthrough that we needed. We don't know if he's the killer, we don't know if he's the witness, but he's the only person that we know that was in that area about the time of the killings. We need to talk to that person.
We snapped a picture, a screenshot of that footage.
We gave it to our patrol officers that worked in those areas of town, contacted business owners. We also went to the media. We thought maybe someone would identify the clothes, maybe someone would remember something. The next step is to notify the families. And we also need to learn from the families, what type of people victims were.
Detective McKinnon tracks down Jason's family.
I never thought I would receive a call telling me my brother has been killed. I didn't believe it. I was really shocked. To lose Jason was devastating. Jason was a really good kid, a very kind person. I couldn't believe him having an enemy. He just had so much love for life. And he's just sad I won't ever talk to him again. And I didn't have a chance or an opportunity to, say goodbye to my brother. I have never heard of Brianna until they were murdered. I guess they were just friends. I think he took her under his wing and tried to protect her because she was so young. She had her whole life ahead of her.
I heard about Brianna's murder from a friend of hers, and I was angry, sad, and I had so many questions, just wondering who did it, why.
When we speak to family members, sometimes they may have learned of things that are going on in the victim's life at the time to help us gather leads. But the family members in both of these victims' case could not lend much information.
After the release of the picture, we got a few tips, but none of them turned out to be accurate.
No one that we spoke with could put a name to this individual. When people get murdered, there's usually a suspect connection to the killer. In this one, we didn't have any, and that was concerning.
The detective's last hope is that ballistics come through with a forensic lead.
The bullets recovered came from a Colt Python 357.
The bullet information then was entered into the nationwide database to compare bullets from different crimes and identify if they match each other. In this case, there was no match. So the bullets were not fired from a gun that had been used in another identified crime before.
At this time, I was thinking we didn't have connections between any of the individuals. Okay, this seemed like unprovoked killing, which really leads me to worry because this is public safety we're talking about. It was a big concern that we would end up with another killing.
911, what's the location of the emergency?
911, where's the emergency?
911, what's the location of your emergency?
Multiple gunshots right outside my window.
And I just heard 5 shots, really loud. How many gunshots did you hear?
Several. Bang, 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 bang.
Okay. And you said he was bleeding from where?
It looks like he's been shot in the back of his head.
Okay.
He's laying on his back and he's bleeding out the back of his head. Are you with that guy now?
He's dead.
You're sure he's dead?
He's dead.
When I arrived at the scene on Boland Street, a young male was laying on the road right in front of a driveway, a pool of blood surrounding him.
We learned his name to be Trayvon Kendall Thompson. He was 21. There was a shot in the torso and then shot in the head. There were no shell casings on the ground. And the accuracy at which this individual was struck, it was surprising because it was like Well, isn't that interesting? What a similarity. This was developing into a pattern of what happened on the bike trail over at Ship Creek. It's this individual walking around, just hunting people.
We need to get witness statements as soon as possible.
So the canvas starts almost immediately to knock on doors and to get people up to see if they heard or saw anything.
As we looked at the street with so many houses, on top of the house, at the end of that driveway where Trey was laying down, there was a camera.
I thought to myself, if this camera was working, it captured the entire case. No one's answering the door, and so we had to figure out who lived there. We needed a search warrant to obtain a surveillance video. And that was concerning because the time was running out to capture this individual.
In the meantime, we had the patrol sergeant notify the mom.
She's distraught, obviously, and she's racking her brain to try to figure out how this situation could have developed.
We learned that Trey was a nice guy, a loved son, a loved brother, a good person.
It was unusual because it just did not make sense why he would become a victim in a case. She said that he had ridden his bicycle from her residence, but when we were at the scene, we did not see a bicycle present.
So that was important information, and we find a bike that could lead us to the suspect.
Later in the day, detectives obtain the warrant for the house with the CCTV camera.
We find out Trayvon Kendall Thompson was going to this location. It's his relative's residence.
They seize the surveillance system.
We hope that it would show the suspect, it would show what happened. Why would someone target Trey Thompson? We hope that it would provide a breakthrough for the case.
Investigators bring up the Boland Street camera and cue up the footage.
Who is this?
As you look at the screen, in the top left corner, you see somebody walk from left to right.
Play it again.
It's dark, it's night. The footage is kind of grainy, but we can see if the person walks. It's like a man. He walks a straight line on the other side of the street.
The footage of Trayvon's murder is too graphic to show.
Watching the surveillance was shocking. It was very chilling. This is the ending of someone's life right before us.
What I saw in front of my eyes was a cold-blooded murder, and it was as cold-blooded as it can get. There couldn't be anything worse.
He's walking along with his hands in his pockets, and out comes the gun from his right front pocket of his jacket. We do see that Trayvon Kendall was riding a bicycle. The killer is actually striking the target that's moving several times. It's like a moment in time that I can't forget. In fact, it was very difficult to watch.
Keep playing. Rewind.
We could see that. He puts the gun back into his pocket. And then he gets the bicycle and pulls it out from under him. And then rides casually away like as if nothing happened.
I felt like chills going down my spine. He was painting the same picture of Jason Netter and Brianna Foisey walking on the trail and then out of nowhere being shot by the suspect.
But this has a very awful twist. We find out Trayvon Kendall Thompson had actually fixed the surveillance system at his relative's residence. And to think that Trayvon Kendall had fixed that particular system to capture his own homicide was just phenomenal. Watching the surveillance again, you can see that there's lots of muzzle flash. This is a big deal. There's always a muzzle flash when a Colt Python goes off. I've heard the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This was like 10,000 words because this is our guy.
Detectives zoom in to try and identify the suspect.
Stop it there.
It's grainy. If you make it bigger, it's going to be more grainy. It was frustrating that we couldn't identify the face. But we could see that the man was wearing kind of like tan pants and a dark jacket.
This person looks like a tall person.
We have a person out there basically gunning down people. I was more and more convinced that they were just random victims. I was determined to do my best to catch that guy.
Let's get this out right away.
We found these teenage girls that had actually walked past the suspect.
The girls are brought in for questioning.
Hi, girls. Thanks for coming in today.
They went inside a residence, several houses down from the shooting. They hear the gunshots. They look out the window and they actually see the individual. They tell us that he was a tall person, got scraggly hair, longer style. He had a camouflage style jacket, wearing a cap and like workers' boots. This was a huge lead. We bring the sketch artists to the police station and they come up with the sketch of what this person looks like.
The best way to expand our investigation would be to release the sketch of the suspect and the photo of Trey's bike in the media in hopes that a member of the public would be able to identify the suspect and solve the case. There's a feeling of urgency. It may be only a matter of time before the next people are killed.
The autopsy report for Trayvon Kendall Thompson comes in.
It's the same gun that was used in the homicides of Jason Netter and Brianna Foisey.
Now, we knew 100% there was a serial killer that was wandering around Anchorage. It was chilling because we've got someone who's out there hunting people.
They were all random victims, and that makes it even more difficult because how do we warn people to be careful when anybody could be a victim.
When we put the sketch out to the public, a lot of people tipped us that said that they knew who it was, but each tip was a red herring.
Slavomir Markowitz.
Yet a lead comes through from an unexpected source.
We were also staying in touch with Trey's mother. She called us. She saw a person on a bike, and she believed it was Trey's bike. She thinks he's the killer, riding that bike and going into the wooded area where there was a kind of homeless camp, just a few blocks away from where Trey was murdered.
And that sparks our interest immediately. When we were at the scene, we saw a bicycle present.
We seized the bicycle. We find a tree stump just a few yards away from the tent. And in that tree stump, the officers find a revolver.
And I'm just like, this is it. Bring the individual to the police station, we talk to him. He has no idea what we're talking about.
Turns out that the suspect is an ex-police officer from New York.
He quit, got out of law enforcement, and he lives off the grid in Alaska, in the woods.
Hang on.
Detectives return to the Boland Street surveillance footage to see if it can reveal any other clues.
We saw the suspect approach the victim and shoot in one-handed with the extended hand.
It wasn't like what police officers would do with a revolver. You shoot in what's called a Weaver stance, and that is where both arms are out in front of you in like a triangle, and this individual was shooting with one hand.
The analysis report on the ex-officer's revolver comes in.
The revolver wasn't a Colt Python. And it wasn't even a functioning revolver. It was a broken down, rusty revolver that hadn't been shot probably for years. We looked closer at the bike that he had, and we compared it to the photos of Trey's bike that we had.
It had curled handlebars. This one we knew that the victim was riding had straight up handlebars.
So for me, that immediately eliminated that ex-police officer from New York. We still have a serial killer on the streets. There is that sense of urgency. We are working, but we are hitting dead ends everywhere.
More than 4 weeks after the first shooting, police still don't have a credible suspect.
I was praying every day that this case would be solved. I wanted some kind of justice for Jason. The next phone call I wanted was, we found the person that did this. Police were keeping up with my family, but not knowing what was going on was extremely, extremely sad. I was pretty devastated.
What is the location of the emergency?
Hello, ma'am. I'm down in the park in Valley of the Moon, and I found this man here. He's lying on the ground. He has blood. I haven't checked his pulse.
You have no idea what happened to him?
No, I walked across him. I don't think he's breathing. He's not moving at all.
On the morning of August 28th, I'm getting a phone call from a patrol sergeant, about a double homicide in the Valley of the Moon Park in Anchorage.
And I respond there along with Slav. There was a lieutenant there. He says, I think we have another one of your cases. You know this is part of the bike trail.
The victim had what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the back. There was some blood. There was a bike. Looked like the victim was riding on the bike, and the bike was still attached to the victim.
And that's not all.
Officers lead me to another victim.
He's sitting at the picnic table. He's got socks in his hand, shoes are off, and he's just sitting there like as if he were changing his shoes. And that seemed unusual, not provoked.
Could you take us to the woman who called this in?
The 911 caller was using the trail and happened to know the victim that was riding the bike, Brady Hassan. So that person was able to give us Bree's name right away. Bree was 25 years old at the time and an environmental activist in town. Somebody well-liked in the community of Anchorage, a good person, a hard worker. The second person was Kevin Turner. We identified him from ID. Kevin Turner had spent some time living on the streets. He wasn't, involved in any criminal activity. We didn't see any reason for him to be killed. Right away, before I even asked, the patrol sergeant says there are no shell casings.
And it was on the bike trail. I was really concerned because I knew it was our same guy. Another one of these random, unprovoked killings. And here we are again.
And there's more bad news.
There are no cameras on that trail. There are no residences within eyesight of that crime scene.
We know we have a serial killer on our hands, but it seemed like we were hitting a lot of dead ends. We can't get ahead of it.
It puts pressure on us. We have to identify him, arrest him before he kills again. Within a few days, we got our confirmation that the bullets that killed Kevin Turner and Brady Hassan came from the same gun that killed Jason Netter, Brianna Foisey, and Trey Thompson. So now we had 5 homicides done with the same gun. The FBI announced a $10,000 reward for anyone coming with information that would help to identify the suspect and solve the case. We received close to 180 tips, but nothing really solid. And the more time is passing, the more likelihood that, he may do it again. So that there's that fear constantly. Then on November 12th, shortly after 4:34 a.m., I got a call from a police sergeant, and the sergeant basically said, we had an officer involved shooting. He's been transported to the hospital. The officer is seriously hurt, but he's alive.
The officer involved, Officer Salau, recorded the confrontation on his dash cam. Detective McKinnon joins Detective Markovich to review the footage.
Our dispatch received a call from a taxi driver about cab fraud.
They were looking for a female who got dropped off at a hotel and didn't pay the cab. Officer Salau is in the area looking for this female. But what he comes upon is a male walking down the street. He's going to ask this male if he has seen the female.
Sir, Anchorage Police, can I get you to stop?
And this person continued to walk on the sidewalk.
Hello, hey there. Want to stop?
And then I look. Oh my gosh, look how tall this person is. We see the cap. We see the camouflage jacket. We see the boots that he was wearing. Very similar clothing that we capture on the Boland Street and Ship Creek case.
This is the Anchorage Police. You need to stop. This is the Anchorage Police. You need to stop. Sir.
The man turns. I can see both of his hands are in his pockets.
Sir.
The patrol officers told us that Salau trips as he's getting out and falls to the ground. The killer approaches Salau and shoots him several times. As he's on the ground, Salau's instincts and training kicked in because he's able to return fire and ultimately shoot him in the head, actually. Salau is able to fight through it. He's able to survive.
However, the suspect dies. Officer Salau is found to have acted reasonably under the circumstances.
Let's see him again.
It's difficult to watch.
This is the Anchorage Police. You need to stop.
It is chilling the way that the whole thing took place and how quick it happened within just a few seconds. But it was relieving because we've caught the person that has likely done all this stuff.
The police await ballistics for proof this suspect is their killer.
Thank you.
They get bullets out of Salau. We rush them to the ballistics guy, and he confirms, in fact, this is the same gun, the Colt Python. We were able to identify the individual, the man who was in the gunfight with Officer Salau. It was James Dale Ritchie.
He bears a startling resemblance to the girl's description of him and the drawing the sketch artist made.
Now we have to link this person actually to the case.
Detectives obtain a search warrant for Ritchie's residence.
We were able to recover 18 shell casings from the Colt Python that were in a closet neatly stored.
We could account for every single bullet that he fired. We had every single shell casings from every single homicide.
It was our solid evidence that James Dale Ritchie was responsible for each one of these killings. James Dale Ritchie is an individual who lived in Anchorage a good part of his life. He was kind of a wanderer for a few years, and he started to have mental illness. His roommate would tell us that he thought that he could change the weather, decide who lives and dies. There's a TV show called The Walking Dead, and in that show, the individual carries the Colt Python. And that individual then shoots zombies in the head in the TV show. And my theory is that James Dale Ritchie was in a crisis with his mental illness, and I think that he may have thought that these were zombie killings, which suggests the accuracy at which he shot the victims. But we were not able to really ever determine the motivation for James Dale Ritchie's killings.
Detectives can't know for sure that the man caught on camera at Ship Creek was James Dale Ritchie, but it set them on the right track.
The video that we captured was crucial in helping us solve this case. The video camera is our unbiased witness. which is really what we enjoy as investigators, because it tells an unbiased story. But in this particular situation, it was critical.
I just couldn't believe one person can do all that. Not only take 5 people's lives, but I'm shooting a police officer 4 times. I didn't want him dead. I wanted him to pay for what he's done to all 5 victims. I would have loved to stand up to him in court. I would say to him that he stole my brother's life from us, and Brianna's life, and, the other victims. He took their lives for nothing.
Hi guys, this is gonna be my first video. I'm kind of scared, a little nervous, but I think I can do this. The first song I'm ever gonna put on my account, yeah!
The pristine facade of suburban tranquility has always been a fragile mask, a thin sheet of glass holding back a darkness that waits for the perfect moment to shatter everything we think we know about safety. In the freezing, bone-chilling winter of 1979, the small, insulated community of Blackwood Ridge was a town built on the unshakable belief that evil belonged somewhere else, that monsters only walked the streets of distant, chaotic cities. Then, on a blinding Friday evening that began with the mundane hum of static on television sets and the smell of wood smoke drifting across manicured lawns, 19-year-old Evelyn Cross stepped out of her family's lit kitchen, walked down a driveway blanketed in fresh snow, and vanished directly into the dark. She did not leave a footprint, she did not sound an alarm, and there was not a single eyewitness to the exact microsecond the universe tore open and swallowed her whole. Her disappearance was not a loud tragedy. It was a silent, devastating evaporation that left an icy crater in the heart of the town, an open wound that bled suspicion, terror, and grief for over 47 years. For nearly 5 decades, the case sat frozen in the dead, climate-controlled steel cabinets of the county precinct, a definitive cold case whose papers grew yellow, whose photographs faded into ghostly outlines, and whose suspect list became a graveyard of ruined reputations and dead-end theories. But beneath the surface of this decades-long paralysis, in the hypermodern laboratories of 2026, where the dead are finally granted a voice, a single, microscopic strand of degraded DNA, recovered from a forgotten, blood-speckled winter scarf, has become the ultimate genetic key to unlocking the vault of this 1979 mystery, dragging a hidden predator from his comfortable sanctuary right into the blinding light of modern justice. The breakthrough did not arrive through a sudden confession or a deathbed revelation. It was the result of a relentless, obsessive genetic genealogy investigation that pushed the boundaries of modern science to hunt a ghost. When the forensic lab results finally hit the investigator's desk, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet to absolute zero. This was not a random match to a transient criminal or an unidentified drifter passing through town on that snowy night in 1979. It was a systemic betrayal that ripped through the very social fabric of Blackwood Ridge. The profile mapped out by the invisible genetic trail pointed directly to a beloved, highly respected figure within the town's own history, a man who had stood on the front lines of the volunteer search parties, a man who had comforted Evelyn's weeping mother, a man who had carried a flashlight into the dark woods to look for the very girl he had already buried. The shockwave of this realization paralyzed the current task force, a sickening, visceral punch to the gut that instantly recontextualized every single police interview, every neighborly interaction, and every archive record from the last 47 years. The monster was not a shadow lurking in the woods. He was the neighbor who lent you his tools, the man who smiled at your children, a permanent, terrifying fixture of the community who had spent half a century watching the town bleed from the inside out while wearing the armor of a saint. The original crime scene from 1979 was a masterclass in psychological erasure, an empty stretch of asphalt at the edge of the Cross property where the physical world simply ceased to record Evelyn's existence. On that bitter night, as the temperature dropped below zero, the initial responding officers found nothing but a pristine, undisturbed layer of snow, and a discarded grocery bag containing a single carton of milk, its contents frozen solid. There were no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, and no blood splatters to indicate that a violent abduction had taken place in broad daylight of the streetlights. It was as if she had dissolved into the winter wind itself, leaving behind a community that immediately imploded under the weight of its own terror. In the weeks that followed, the police departments of the late 70s were utterly unequipped to handle a predator of this caliber, their methods restricted to primitive fingerprint lifting, door-to-door canvas interviews that yielded nothing but rumors, and a complete lack of centralized data. The killer had operated with a terrifying, intuitive understanding of the police's limitations, utilizing the biting winter storm to wash away any trace of his presence, and relying on the town's inherent politeness to keep anyone from asking the hard questions. Blackwood Ridge became a panopticon of fear, where locked doors replaced open porches, where parents looked at their closest friends with sudden, sharp suspicion, and where the innocence of a generation was murdered alongside a girl who never made it home. As the forensic truth of 2026 now forces this ancient horror into the open, the legal and social machinery of the state is grinding forward with an intensity that is completely overwhelming the senses of the remaining survivors. The courtroom has become a time capsule where the low-resolution, analog world of 1979 is being systematically dismantled by the high-definition, unyielding precision of modern DNA analysis. The prosecution is pulling back a curtain that has been closed for a lifetime, revealing a dual existence so deeply disturbing it defies human comprehension. They are displaying the timeline of a man who spent his days constructing houses, attending town halls, and raising a family of his own, while his nights were dedicated to the silent preservation of his dark secret. The evidence lockers have yielded items that have not seen the light of day since Jimmy Carter was in the White House: rusted car keys, old Polaroids, and the moldering fabric of a winter scarf that held the ultimate, undeniable truth. This is the true horror of a genetic breakthrough, the realization that the past never truly dies, that it waits in the marrow of our bones and the dust of our basements until science advances far enough to drag it into the courtroom, forcing a 78-year-old grandfather to face the monstrous echo of his 21-year-old self. The deployment of investigative genetic genealogy has effectively weaponized the public's own family history against the killer, using a distant cousin's curiosity about their family tree to track down a murderer who thought he had outrun the clock. By uploading the profile from the crime scene scarf into a massive, open-source genealogical database, investigators constructed a vast, interlocking family tree that spanned generations, slowly narrowing the focus down from hundreds of thousands of individuals to a single family unit that resided in Blackwood Ridge in 1979. It was a digital dragnet that the killer could never have anticipated when he committed his crime in an era of landline telephones and rotary televisions. The precision of the match left no room for legal maneuvering, no space for the defense to argue contamination or mistake. The DNA profile was a genetic fingerprint, a unique sequence of numbers and letters that shouted his name across a gulf of nearly 50 years. The townspeople who are old enough to remember the original disappearance are standing outside the courthouse in stunned, catatonic silence, watching a frail old man in a wheelchair being pushed into the building, trying to reconcile the image of this broken elder with the vibrant, terrifying predator who stole their peace in the winter of 1979. For the surviving members of the Cross family, this sudden, late-stage breakthrough is not a moment of healing, but a violent, emotional exhumation that has shattered the fragile peace they spent decades trying to build. Evelyn's younger brother, who was only 8 years old when she vanished, has spent his entire adult life walking in the shadow of an phantom sister, his family permanently broken by the unresolved trauma of that winter night. The news of the arrest did not lift a weight from his shoulders. It dropped a mountain of renewed grief onto his chest, forcing him to realize that the man who had murdered his sister had lived less than 3 miles away for his entire life. The family must now endure the public reopening of their private agony, their names splashed across digital news feeds, their old family photographs analyzed by millions of true crime consumers who treat their life-altering tragedy as a passing internet sensation. They sit in the front row of the gallery, their faces etched with the deep, permanent lines of a half-century of unanswered questions, staring at the back of the suspect's head, searching for a sign of remorse that will never come from a mind that is fundamentally devoid of human empathy. The current generation of investigators is walking through a minefield of historical guilt, constantly looking back at the mistakes of their predecessors and wondering how a clue so glaring could have been ignored for so long. They look at the original case files and see the notes where the suspect was interviewed 3 separate times in 1980, his alibi accepted without verification simply because he was a local boy from a good family, a young man who didn't fit the psychological profile of a transient drifter that the FBI was pushing at the time. The weight of this institutional failure hangs heavily over the precinct, a reminder that the system is only as good as the human beings who run it, and that prejudice, complacency, and a desire for easy answers can allow a monster to escape justice for a lifetime. The detectives know that this breakthrough is a victory for technology, but it is also a condemnation of the past, a stark realization that Evelyn Cross was abandoned by the very people who swore to protect her, left to lie in an unmarked grave while her killer enjoyed the full, unhurried span of a prosperous life. The town of Blackwood Ridge is currently experiencing an identity crisis of epic proportions, its historical narrative completely rewritten by a single lab report from a genetic genealogy company. The older residents are realizing that their entire lives were lived in a state of manufactured ignorance, that the peaceful, idyllic community they thought they were raising their children in was a lie maintained by a murderer. The younger generation, who only knew Evelyn Cross as a cautionary tale told by anxious parents, is looking at the town's elders with a new, cynical detachment, wondering what other secrets are buried beneath the pristine lawns of their neighborhood. The geography of the town has been irrevocably altered. The old woods are no longer a place for recreation, but a monumental crime scene, a location where a girl's life was violently stolen and where a community's trust was buried for 47 years. The air in Blackwood Ridge feels thick, stagnant, and heavy with the scent of uncovered rot, a community entirely paralyzed by the sudden, undeniable intrusion of its own dark history. The media coverage of the breakthrough has turned the town into a hyperkinetic circus of sensationalism, with live trucks blocking the intersections and reporters broadcasting hourly updates from the edge of the property where Evelyn was last seen. The digital age has transformed this 1979 cold case into a viral commodity, complete with true crime influencers dissecting the suspect's old high school yearbook photos and armchair detectives offering wild, unsubstantiated theories about potential unresolved crimes in the area. The authentic, agonizing grief of the community has been completely flattened by the content machine, reduced to a collection of keywords, hashtags, and algorithms designed to maximize engagement. The townspeople are withdrawing into their homes, pulling down the blinds to escape the flashing lights of the cameras, realizing that their private nightmare has become public property, a spectacle to be consumed and then discarded by an audience that will move on to the next tragedy by the end of the week. In the final, suffocating moments before the preliminary hearing begins, the courthouse hallway becomes a corridor of absolute, electric tension, the past and the present locked in a silent, dead-eyed standoff. The lawyers are shuffling their papers, the digital audio recorders are huming, and the security guards are standing with their hands on their utility belts, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of volatility. The suspect sits in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, his face an unreadable mask of age and absolute, clinical detachment, a man who has outlived his crime but could not outrun his own genetic code. The room falls completely silent as the judge takes the bench, a silence that feels like the holding of a collective breath that has been trapped in the lungs of this town since 1979. The cold case is finally breaking open. The truth is finally going to be read into the record, and the long, agonizing silence of Blackwood Ridge is about to be shattered by the definitive, unyielding voice of forensic science. The sun begins to drop behind the gray, winter skyline of Blackwood Ridge, casting long, stark shadows across the asphalt where Evelyn Cross took her final steps 47 years ago. The genetic genealogy breakthrough has delivered the answer that 3 generations of detectives could not find, but it has also left the town with a terrifying, permanent understanding of its own vulnerability. The killer has been identified, the handcuffs have been slapped onto his wrists, and the legal process will eventually reach its clinical, ordered conclusion. But as the town looks toward the winter of 2026, they know that the truth is a heavy, sharp instrument that does not just resolve the past. It cuts deep into the present, leaving behind a community that must now learn how to live with the knowledge that the dark was never outside their walls, that the monster was always inside, and that the silence they lived with for half a century was the sound of a predator walking among them, completely unpunished, completely invisible, and completely at home. The reality of this case is that it reopens a wound that was never allowed to scar over properly, forcing everyone to look at the fragility of their own history. The 1979 disappearance of Evelyn Cross is no longer an unsolved mystery to be discussed with a sense of distant curiosity. It is alive, bleeding trauma that demands a total reckoning from every single person who lived through it. The genetic genealogy test didn't just find a suspect. It found a mirror, and it forced Blackwood Ridge to look at what happens when a community chooses comfort over vigilance, when it allows politeness to silence suspicion, and when it forgets that the dark is always waiting for the lights to go out. The clock on the wall of the precinct continues to tick, a steady, mechanical reminder that time is an unyielding force. But as the files are finally moved from the cold case archive to the active prosecution drawer, the town knows that the long night that began in 1979 is finally drawing to a close, leaving them under a cold, bright morning where the truth is finally, undeniably, the only thing left standing. The transition from the old theories to the new forensic reality is a violent shock to the system, a total destruction of the folklore that had grown around the case over the decades. For years, the townspeople had comforted themselves with the myth of the highway phantom, the imaginary, faceless monster who had drifted into town from the interstate, taken Evelyn, and drifted out, leaving their local community blameless. To discover that the phantom was a local boy, a young man who had grown up in their schools, worked on their houses, and sat in their pews, is a psychological displacement that is almost too much to bear. It means that the danger was domestic, that the rot was native, and that the town had spent 47 years protecting its own executioner through a collective, subconscious desire to maintain the illusion of its own innocence. This realization is the true poison of the cold case breakthrough, a slow-acting toxin that is currently dissolving the remaining trust in Blackwood Ridge, leaving the community to face the winter of 2026 with its eyes wide open and its heart entirely hollowed out. As the evening task force clears the desks and prepares for the upcoming trial, the old detective who originally handled the case in 1979 sits in a chair in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the modern monitors displaying the genetic markers that solved his life's failure. He doesn't look victorious. He looks exhausted. A man who has carried a ghost for nearly 50 years only to realize that the ghost was living down the street the entire time. He knows that his career, his legacy, and his peace of mind were all casualties of a killer who is simply too normal to be suspected, a monster who used the ordinary routines of suburban life as a perfect, impenetrable shield. The breakthrough has arrived, the science has worked, and the suspect is behind bars. But for the old detective, and for the town of Blackwood Ridge, the true reckoning has only just begun, a long, painful walk through the wreckage of a 50-year lie toward a justice that arrives so late it feels almost like an afterthought. The final, lingering impression of this historic breakthrough is the sheer, terrifying power of the biological record, the knowledge that every human being carries within their cells a permanent, unalterable history of their actions that can be read by future generations. The killer of 1979 thought he had committed the perfect crime, that by washing away the physical tracks in the snow, he had erased his connection to Evelyn Cross forever. He did not know that he had left behind a microscopic, immortal witness, a sequence of DNA that would survive the decay of the scarf, the passing of the decades, and the total transformation of the world around it. This is the ultimate lesson of the Blackwood Ridge breakthrough, that the past is never truly buried, that the truth is an indestructible force, and that no matter how long the silence lasts, no matter how deep the shadow grows, the light of science will eventually find its way into the dark, forcing the monsters of our past to stand before the judgment of our present, whether they are ready or not. The digital clock in the forensic lab blinks as the final confirmation report is saved into the permanent database, a silent, electronic exclamation point at the end of a 47-year search. The machinery of justice is now fully in motion, a cold, bureaucratic process that will dissect every aspect of the suspect's life from 1979 to the present day, looking for other victims, other secrets, other shadows that he might have left behind during his long, unpunished run. The town of Blackwood Ridge will watch this process with a mixture of dread and fascination, trapped in a state of suspended animation until the final verdict is read, until the prison doors close on the monster who lived next door, and until the ghost of Evelyn Cross is finally allowed to rest beneath the snow, her story finished, her name cleared, and her killer finally, undeniably brought to the end of his road. The transition from the cold archive to the live courtroom is not an easy one for the community to navigate, as it requires them to look at old photographs not with nostalgia, but with a sharp, forensic eye. They see the suspect at neighborhood barbecues in 1985, smiling into the camera while holding a paper plate, and they realize that the hands holding that plate were the same hands that had strangled the life out of a 19-year-old girl just a few years prior. They see him at church functions in 1995, shaking hands with the local pastor, and they realize that his entire life was a carefully calculated performance, a decades-long exercise in sociological camouflage designed to hide the black, hollow core of a psychopath. This is the true damage of the breakthrough, the total contamination of their memory, the realization that their history was not a peaceful progression of events, but a horror film playing in slow motion while they all smiled for the camera. The legal teams are now working around the clock, preparing the arguments that will define the upcoming trial, a proceeding that will be less about the classic whodunit and more about the absolute, clinical presentation of scientific certainty. The defense will attempt to attack the chain of custody of the scarf, to question the accuracy of the genealogical databases, and to paint the 78-year-old suspect as a victim of state overreach and unreliable technology. But the prosecution is armed with a truth that does not lie, a truth that does not forget, and a truth that is not subject to the fragile, failing memory of human witnesses. They have the genetic code, the unalterable blueprint of the killer's identity, and they will use it like a scalpel to cut away the decades of lies until there is nothing left but the raw, naked fact of his guilt. As the winter wind begins to howl through the valley of Blackwood Ridge, rattling the windows of the precinct and scattering the dry, dead leaves across the empty streets, the town enters a period of profound, collective introspection. They are a community that has been stripped of its illusions, forced to stand in the cold, hard light of a reality they spent 47 years trying to avoid. They know that the trial will be painful, that the details will be graphic, and that the shockwaves will continue to tear through their families for generations to come. But they also know that this is the only way to heal, that the infection of the secret had to be dragged into the open before the town could ever truly breathe again, and that the long, dark winter that began in 1979 is finally, irrevocably coming to an end. The genetic genealogy breakthrough has effectively dismantled the wall of time that the killer had built around himself, proving that in the modern era, there is no such thing as a clean getaway, no such thing as a permanent secret, and no such thing as a safe place to hide a crime. The monster of Blackwood Ridge is trapped in a room of his own making, his walls closing in as the scientific evidence multiplies, his decades of freedom revealed as nothing more than a temporary reprieve from an inevitable, genetic destiny. The town will watch him stand before the court. They will hear his name read into the record of infamy, and they will finally, after a lifetime of waiting, know that justice has arrived, late, cold, and heavy, but with a force that nothing in this world can ever stop or turn back. The files are stacked high on the prosecutor's desk, each folder a testament to the decades of work that went into keeping Evelyn Cross's memory alive, a monument to the stubborn, unyielding refusal of a few dedicated human beings to let a girl be forgotten. The upcoming trial will be the final chapter in a story that has consumed the lives of generations of detectives, a story that began with a disappearance in the snow and ends with a DNA match in a computer database. The town of Blackwood Ridge will never be the same, its innocence gone, its history scarred, but as the lights of the precinct remain burning late into the night, there is a quiet, settled understanding that the truth is finally home and that the long night is over. The transition from the old era to the new is marked by a deep, resonant silence that hangs over the entire valley, a silence that is different from the fearful quiet of the past 50 years. This is the silence of resolution, the quiet that comes after a long, brutal storm has finally blown itself out, leaving the landscape changed but stable. The residents of Blackwood Ridge are looking at their town with new eyes, seeing the flaws, the vulnerabilities, and the scars, but also seeing the possibility of a future that is built on the truth rather than a comfortable illusion. They know that the road ahead is long, that the trial will be a crucible, but they are ready to face it because they know that the alternative is to return to the dark, and that is a place they are never going to go again. The suspect sits in his jail cell, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with a relentless, irritating frequency, a sound that matches the frantic, trapped rhythm of his own thoughts as he realizes that his 47-year lie has collapsed around him. He is no longer the respected builder, the good neighbor, the family man. He is just a number in the state system, a body waiting for a trial that will formalize his status as a monster. He looks at his hands, the hands that built homes and strangled a life, and he realizes that the invisible trail he left behind on that winter scarf was the one thing he could never wash away, the genetic signature that would eventually seal his fate and drag him into the light. The family of Evelyn Cross has released a simple, dignified statement to the press, refusing to engage with the sensationalism of the media but expressing a profound, quiet gratitude for the science and the dedication that brought them this answer. They are not celebrating, they are mourning, reopening the box of their original grief, but doing so with the knowledge that the mystery is gone, that the phantom has a name, and that the man who took their daughter will never be able to hurt another soul. They are preparing for the trial not with a desire for vengeance, but with a demand for dignity, an unyielding insistence that Evelyn's life be honored by the absolute, uncompromising execution of the law. As the task force prepares the final exhibits for the grand jury, the room feels lighter, as if the physical weight of the 47-year cold case has finally been lifted from the shelves, leaving behind an open space where a new history can begin to be written. The detectives know that their work is not done, that the trial will require a flawless presentation of the forensic data, but they also know that they have crossed the most difficult river, that the identity of the monster is no longer a question, but a fact. They look out the window at the town of Blackwood Ridge, watching the cars move through the streets, knowing that beneath the surface of that ordinary routine, a profound, historic transformation is taking place, a community finally waking up from a 50-year sleep. The genetic genealogy breakthrough in the case of Evelyn Cross is a watershed moment for the entire field of cold case investigation, a powerful demonstration that no case is truly hopeless as long as there is biological evidence preserved in the archives. It sends a clear, terrifying message to every unpunished predator who thinks they have escaped the consequences of their actions. The clock is ticking, the science is advancing, and your own DNA is waiting to betray you to the generation you thought you would never have to face. The monsters of the past are no longer safe in the shadows of time. They are being hunted by the future, and their extraction is inevitable. The sun has fully set now, leaving Blackwood Ridge in the deep, heavy blue of a winter night, the streetlights flickering on to illuminate the quiet, snowy paths where a 19-year-old girl walked into history 47 years ago. The town is quiet, but it is a wakeful, alert quiet, the silence of a community that has finally found its voice and is ready to speak the truth. The genetic genealogy test has cracked the case, the suspect is in custody, and the long, agonizing journey toward justice is nearing its final destination, leaving Blackwood Ridge under a sky that is clear, cold, and entirely free of secrets. The echo of that cold forensic revelation did not merely break the silence. It acted as a psychological sledgehammer, fracturing the remaining illusions of Blackwood Ridge with a devastating, absolute finality. When the details of the genetic connection began to leak into the public consciousness, the town did not erupt into a frenzy of standard true crime chatter. It shrank, withdrawing into a protective, terrified state of collective shock. For nearly 50 years, The narrative of Evelyn Cross's disappearance had been polished into a manageable, almost mythic tragedy, a dark folklore about an opportunistic outsider, a faceless phantom who had materialized from the freezing mist of 1979 and dissolved back into the void. To suddenly discover that the phantom possessed a local address, a familiar face, and a highly respected name within their own civic directory was a mutation of reality that the older generation was entirely unequipped to process. The geographical distance between the crime scene and the suspect's living room was less than a 3-minute drive, a suffocatingly tight radius that meant every resident had spent their entire adult life crossing paths with a monster while believing they were simply exchanging pleasantries with a pillar of the community. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough transformed the physical streets of Blackwood Ridge into a hypervigilant landscape of intense, retroactive scrutiny. People looked out their front windows not to check the weather, but to stare at the spaces where the suspect had once operated with total social immunity. The local construction sites he had managed, the houses he had renovated, the very structural foundations of the town he had helped physically shape over the decades now felt deeply contaminated by his hidden pathology. Every interaction from the past 47 years was suddenly dragged into a mental interrogation room. Every casual wave from his pickup truck, every donation he made to the school fundraiser, every solemn nod he offered at local funerals. The town realized, with a sickening sense of collective violation, that his profound good citizenship had not been a redemption or a separate phase of life. It had been a deliberate, structural camouflage, a cold and calculated performance designed to turn the community's own decency into an impenetrable shield against suspicion. The investigative task force found themselves working inside an absolute pressure cooker of historical reevaluation, surrounded by the ghosts of their predecessors' systemic failures. They began the grueling, continuous process of auditing every single handwritten log, every typed tip sheet, and every audio cassette from the winter of 1979, looking for the exact moments where the original detectives had allowed politeness to override protocol. They discovered a pattern of institutional deference that was infuriating in its simplicity. The suspect had been excluded from deep vetting early on precisely because he was a known quantity, a local boy whose family had deep roots in the valley, an individual whose grief appeared so authentic that asking for a strict alibi verification felt like an insult to a mourning neighbor. This revelation turned the precinct into a somber, intensely focused bunker, where modern detectives realized they weren't just prosecuting a historic murder, they were executing an autopsy on the very concept of suburban trust. The media apparatus, completely unmoored from the ethical constraints of the past, rapidly escalated its occupation of the town, turning the local trauma into a 24-hour digital coliseum. The intersections were permanently choked with live broadcast trucks, their telescoping satellite masts cutting through the winter sky like metallic needles, while independent true crime creators stalked the perimeters of the suspect's property with handheld gimbals and directional microphones. The authentic, slow-burning grief of the remaining family members was instantly transformed into a viral commodity, broken down into clickbait headlines, 10-second video loops, and speculative social media threads that prioritized engagement over truth. The residents of Blackwood Ridge felt the walls of their private lives crumbling as their hometown was analyzed by millions of global spectators who treated their multi-generational nightmare as a passing internet curiosity, a background distraction to be consumed on a screen and forgotten by Monday. Beneath the sensationalized circus of the press, a much deeper, more insidious erosion was taking place within the interpersonal relationships of the town's older residents. The social glue that had held the community together through the dark decades following 1979, the shared vigils, the collective memory of the search, the unspoken pact to protect one another, was rapidly dissolving under the acid of retroactive paranoia. If a man like him could carry a secret of that magnitude for 47 years without a single slip of the tongue, without a single flicker of visible guilt in his eyes, then who else was performing a part? Every old friendship was suddenly subjected to a cold, forensic reappraisal. Every long-standing neighborly bond was tested by the terrifying realization that human beings are capable of a total, absolute compartmentalization of evil. The town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a grid of isolated households, each one pulling down its shades, locking its doors, and staring into the dark with a sudden, haunting knowledge that the surface of things tells you absolutely nothing about what lies underneath. The legal strategy for the upcoming prosecution was being forged in a state of absolute clinical precision, with the state's attorneys recognizing that they could not rely on the failing, fragile memories of witnesses who were now in their 70s and 80s. They placed the entire weight of their case on the unyielding, mathematical certainty of the genetic profile, treating the degraded winter scarf not as a relic, but as an immortal, biological eyewitness that had spent 47 years waiting to testify in a digital language. The forensic technicians worked in sterile, positive pressure environments, using advanced replication techniques to extract every single viable locus from the ancient fabric, ensuring that when the data was presented to the grand jury, it would land with the undeniable force of a scientific law. They were constructing a cage made of numbers and genetic strings, a structure so tight that no amount of legal maneuvering, character reference, or appeals to the suspect's advanced age could ever find a loophole to exploit. The defense, meanwhile, was preparing a desperate, scorched-earth counteroffensive that sought to weaponize the very passage of time against the state's forensic triumph. Operating from a position of profound structural disadvantage, the suspect's lawyers began filing a relentless sequence of motions aimed at challenging the integrity of the chain of custody from 1979, arguing that the storage conditions in the old evidence locker were primitive, unmonitored, and ripe for cross-contamination. They sought to paint the 78-year-old man not as a historic predator, but as a frail, cognitively failing victim of modern technology's overreach, an elder whose twilight years were being violently disrupted by unreliable algorithms and the overzealous ambitions of a new generation of law enforcement. This legal posturing added a layer of systemic, bureaucratic tension to the air, a cold undercurrent of chess-like maneuvering that threatened to turn the hunt for truth into a war of technical attrition. For the brother of Evelyn Cross, the progression of the case had become a relentless, hallucinatory confrontation with a past he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. The physical presence of the suspect in an orange jumpsuit, captured in low-resolution prison transport photos, did not offer a sense of relief or justice. It shattered the fragile, numb equilibrium he had constructed to survive the loss of his family. He found himself walking the floor of his house late at night, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounding exactly like the footsteps he used to listen for when he was an 8-year-old boy waiting for a sister who would never walk through the door. He was trapped in a state of chronological vertigo, where the winter of 1979 and the winter of 2026 had collapsed into a single, continuous moment of profound, agonizing clarity, forcing him to witness the total destruction of his childhood all over again, this time under the blinding, merciless lights of a public tribunal. The younger generation of Blackwood Ridge, those who had grown up viewing Evelyn Cross as a ghost story or a line in a historical text, looked at the unfolding drama with a sharp, cynical detachment that deeply unsettled the town's elders. They didn't feel the paralyzing grief of the past, but they felt a profound anger at the culture of complacency that had allowed the suspect to live a full, unbothered, and prosperous life at the expense of a girl's memory. They began using digital archives to map the suspect's life against the history of the town, creating independent timelines that highlighted every public event he had attended, every municipal project he had been paid to build, and every photograph where he stood smiling alongside the very people whose trust he had permanently murdered. This generational divide created a silent, simmering friction within the community, a clash between those who wanted to process the horror through the quiet, traditional channels of suburban mourning and those who demanded a loud, aggressive, and total demolition of the town's historic facade. The physical terrain of Blackwood Ridge itself seemed to reject the attempt to move forward, the heavy winter sky hanging low over the valley like a wet, gray shroud that kept the cold air trapped between the ridges. The vacant lot where the suspect's old construction warehouse had stood was now surrounded by police tape and security barriers, the ground frozen too solid for the forensic teams to begin the deeper excavation work that everyone whispered was inevitable. Rumors rippled through the local coffee shops and hardware stores like low-frequency electricity, Whispers that Evelyn Cross was not the only one, that the suspect's travel logs from the early 80s matched other unresolved disappearances along the state corridor, that the garage of his primary residence held secrets that would turn the local tragedy into a multi-state horror film. The town was living on a knife's edge, terrified of the next press conference, terrified of what the ground would reveal when the snow finally melted, completely paralyzed by the realization that they were only at the very beginning of a long, dark unraveling. The old detective who had first held the file in 1979 spent his days sitting in his car near the edge of the courthouse property, his health too fragile to join the scrum inside, but his mind completely anchored to the proceeding. He would stare through the windshield at the modern reporters, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that betrayed the decades of silent, corrosive guilt he had carried through his retirement. He remembered the exact smell of the snow on the night she vanished, the exact tone of the suspect's voice when he had offered to help clear the brush near the driveway, the exact look of calm, unbothered innocence that had deflected his instincts 47 years ago. He knew that no matter what the court decided, no matter how many years the suspect spent in a maximum security cell, his own legacy was permanently tied to a 47-year failure, a realization that turned the late-stage breakthrough into a cold, bittersweet pill that offered no real cure for his exhaustion. Inside the local church, the site where the original community had gathered in 1979 to pray for Evelyn's safe return, the atmosphere had shifted from one of traditional pastoral comfort to one of deep, theological crisis. The current sermons could no longer rely on the easy platitudes of grace and ultimate redemption. They had to grapple with the terrifying, immediate reality of a human being who had sat in those very pews, taken communion with those very hands, and then walked out into the sunlight to continue living a life built on a foundation of murder. The parishioners sat in the old wooden seats with a rigid, unnatural posture, looking around at the empty spaces between them, wondering if the person sitting next to them was carrying their own silent, unpunished darkness. The church was no longer a refuge from the evils of the world. It was a place where the town was forced to confront the absolute fragility of its moral fabric, a community entirely stripped of its spiritual armor. The prosecution's filing of the formal discovery documents brought a fresh wave of visceral horror to the public record, as the clinical descriptions of the suspect's domestic life were laid bare for the first time. The inventory lists from the search of his residence included items that were sickening in their ordinary placement. Evelyn's original school identification card found inside an old metal tin containing spare buttons and sewing supplies, located in a workshop less than 10 feet from where his own grandchildren played during holiday visits. The absolute proximity of the trophy to the ordinary routines of family life was a detail that broke the remaining psychological defenses of the townspeople. It proved that the predator did not need a secret bunker or a hidden cabin in the mountains. He had integrated the evidence of his violence directly into the domestic scenery, utilizing the utter boringness of suburban life as the most effective cloaking device ever created. The legal machinery continued its unyielding, bureaucratic march toward the trial date, each court appearance by the suspect drawing thousands of digital eyes to the small county courthouse. The suspect himself remained an absolute, terrifying cipher during these proceedings, never looking at the gallery, never addressing the court directly, his breath rattling softly in the microphone whenever he was forced to state his name for the record. He looked like an old man who was simply tired of the noise, an elder who was counting the days until the circus left town, a posture that infuriated the observers who wanted to see a monster and instead found nothing but the mundane, fading biology of an ordinary senior. This was the ultimate frustration of the cold case breakthrough, the realization that the system could punish the body, but it could never reach into the past and extract the decades of stolen life, leaving the community to settle for a clinical, legally precise transaction that felt entirely inadequate compared to the scale of the damage. As the evening task force wrapped up another day of data entry, the modern lead investigator stood at the window overlooking Main Street, watching the streetlights flicker to life in the winter twilight. The digital files on his screen were organized into neat, colored folders, a stark contrast to the chaotic, blood-speckled reality of the crime they represented. He knew that the genetic genealogy test had done what no amount of traditional detective work could have achieved. It had broken through the wall of time, It had identified the suspect, and it had delivered a level of forensic certainty that was mathematically unassailable. But as he looked out at the quiet, darkened houses of Blackwood Ridge, he knew that the true victory was still far off, that the town was currently bleeding from 1,000 internal cuts, and that the long, painful road toward a genuine, structural recovery was a journey that the community would have to take alone, step by step, through the wreckage of a 50-year lie. The silence that settled over Blackwood Ridge as the night deepened was not the peaceful quiet of an ordinary suburb. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a town that was actively holding its breath. The residents lay in their beds, listening to the winter wind rattle the frames of their windows, their minds turning over the details of the lab reports, the court filings, and the memories of the man who had lived among them as a wolf in the fold. The genetic key had unlocked the vault. The truth was out in the cold air, and the illusion of safety was gone forever. They were a community that had been forced to wake up from a half-century sleep, and as they stared into the darkness of the winter night, they knew that the morning would bring no easy comfort, only the hard, unyielding light of a reality that they would have to learn to live with, together, for the rest of their lives. The transition from the grand jury indictment to the formal pretrial evidentiary hearings did not cool the atmosphere in Blackwood Ridge. Instead, it acted as a chemical catalyst, turning the town's localized dread into a volatile, suffocating legal siege. As the calendar bled into the early months of 2026, the local courthouse was transformed from a quiet provincial building into a hyper-secure, heavily fortified fortress of modern forensic accountability. The air inside the main gallery was permanently thick with the distinct, metallic scent of industrial floor cleaners and the stale, nervous sweat of a community forced to sit shoulder to shoulder with its own history. Every seat was occupied by 7 in the morning, a grim congregation of the old and the young, all staring at the empty defense table with an intensity that felt heavy enough to warp the wood. When the 78-year-old suspect was finally wheeled into the room by county sheriffs, his oxygen tank clicking with a rhythmic, mechanical hiss, the collective intake of breath from the observers sounded like a sharp wind passing through dead trees. The visual contrast was infuriatingly vast, a frail, trembling old man with liver spots on his hands and a fading patch of white hair, juxtaposed against the terrifying, immortal phantom who had dragged a 19-year-old girl into a winter blizzard 47 years ago. The focus of this third phase of the unraveling was not the emotional weight of the crime, but a brutal, clinical war over the raw mechanics of the evidence itself. The defense launched a massive, multi-tiered assault on the very foundation of the genetic genealogy match, attempting to systematically dismantle the state's forensic triumph through a sequence of highly technical legal motions. For 3 consecutive weeks, the courtroom was plunged into a dizzying, jargon-heavy lexicon of alleles, centimorgans, locus degradation, and chain-of-custody protocols from the late 70s. The defense attorneys, pacing aggressively before the bench, argued with a fierce, cold desperation that the blood-speckled winter scarf recovered in 1979 had been stored under primitive, unscientific conditions for nearly 5 decades, subjected to shifting humidity, potential cross-contamination from unrelated cases, and the unregulated handling of dozens of long-retired officers. They painted the modern genealogy database as an algorithmic panopticon, an unreliable digital dragnet that had violated the privacy of thousands of innocent citizens to manufacture a statistical scapegoat out of a dying man whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution met this offensive not with rhetoric, but with an unyielding, mathematical wall of state-of-the-art laboratory validation. They called a succession of elite forensic geneticists and molecular biologists to the stand, turning the witness box into a high-definition seminar on modern DNA recovery. The experts explained to the captivated, terrified jury pool how advanced negative pressure clean rooms and automated extraction technology had allowed them to isolate the suspect's epithelial cells from the deepest layers of the scarf's fabric fibers, cells that had remained sealed away from environmental contamination, like a biological time capsule. The genetic markers did not present a vague probability. They delivered an absolute, crushing certainty, a statistical match with an error margin of 1 in several hundred billion. To watch the data charts projected onto the massive courtroom screens was to witness the total, absolute destruction of human deception by the immortal record of biology. The suspect's own genetic code was singing his true name across a gulf of half a century, rendering his decades of silence, his performative neighborliness, and his respectable local legacy completely irrelevant in the face of science. Outside the courtroom walls, the internal rot within the social infrastructure of Blackwood Ridge was accelerating at a visible, terrifying pace. The Community Clearinghouse initiative, which had been established in the wake of the arrest to help neighbors process the collective trauma, rapidly degenerated into an informal, paranoid tribunal of historical suspicion. The older residents, many of whom had spent their entire lives building a shared network of trust, could no longer look at one another without running their memories through a dark, retroactive filter. If the suspect could maintain a flawless facade of gentle normalcy for 47 years while harboring the memory of a violent strangulation, who is to say that other long-standing secrets weren't buried beneath the manicured lawns of the valley? Old rivalries from the 1980s were weaponized anew. Casual comments made at neighborhood block parties decades ago were suddenly re-examined for hidden significance, and a suffocating, icy draft of interpersonal distance settled over the cul-de-sacs. The town was discovering that the worst consequence of a cold case breakthrough is not the revelation of the monster's identity, but the total, permanent poisoning of the water supply of human connection. The brother of Evelyn Cross had become a permanent fixture in the front row of the prosecution's gallery, his physical presence acting as a silent, crushing weight on the legal proceedings. He sat completely motionless for hours, his eyes locked onto the profile of the suspect's face, searching for some microscopic flicker of recognition, some tiny fracture in the old man's clinical detachment. In his mind, the modern courtroom had entirely dissolved, replaced by the perpetual, freezing echo of that Friday evening in 1979. He was no longer an adult navigating a complex legal system. He was an 8-year-old boy standing at the window, watching the snow fall onto an empty driveway, waiting for a sister who is currently being erased from the world less than 3 miles away. This chronological vertigo was a physical affliction, a constant, sickening pressure in his chest that made it impossible to sleep, impossible to breathe, and impossible to accept the clinical, polite pace of the pretrial arguments. He didn't want a war of technical motions. He wanted a total, uncompromising reckoning that could match the absolute devastation that had been visited upon his family for a lifetime. Meanwhile, the investigative task force was extending its grid of inquiry far beyond the original borders of the 1979 file, driven by the terrifying realization that a predator of this caliber rarely stops at a single victim. A team of young, digital native detectives was currently auditing every unresolved missing person report, every unidentified body file, and every cold assault case along the state highway corridor between the years of 1975 and 1995. They were utilizing modern database cross-referencing to overlay the suspect's historic construction travel logs, his fuel receipts, and his property acquisition records against the geography of unsolved regional violence. The results of this secondary audit were being kept under a strict seal of absolute secrecy, but the constant, late-night activity inside the precinct's basement archives sent a clear signal to the local community. The town was living on the precipice of a multi-state horror story, waiting for the other shoe to drop, terrified that the ground beneath their feet was about to open up and reveal a graveyard of forgotten names. The media coverage had reached a state of saturated, hyperkinetic distortion that was actively suffocating the daily commerce of Blackwood Ridge. The town had been entirely consumed by the true crime industrial complex, its local businesses forced to operate under the constant gaze of international news crews and independent live streamers who set up permanent camps along Main Street. The local diner, where generations of townspeople had gathered to discuss the weather and high school sports, was now a backdrop for true crime podcasts, its booths occupied by self-proclaimed experts who dissected the suspects' old yearbook photos while drinking lukewarm coffee. This commodification of their private trauma turned the residents into ghosts within their own town, their authentic, multi-generational grief reduced to a series of keywords and engagement metrics for an audience that viewed their lives as nothing more than a highly addictive winter distraction. The generational divide within Blackwood Ridge was widening into a chasm of mutual resentment as the pretrial hearings dragged into the spring. The younger generation, raised on a digital diet of skepticism and institutional distrust, viewed the older generation's historic blindness not as a tragedy, but as a form of criminal complacency. They organized independent digital archives, mapping the suspects' construction business contracts against the historic expansion of the town, publicly highlighting how the local government had effectively funded the killer's comfortable lifestyle for decades using taxpayer money. They demanded a total, public dismantling of the town's historical narrative, a purge of the old civic pride that they argued had been nothing more than a protective wall for a local predator. The elders, defensive and exhausted by the relentless exposure, retreated into a bitter, isolated silence, feeling as though they were being put on trial alongside the monster simply for the crime of wanting to believe their home was safe. Inside the suspect's residence, which had remained under a continuous, multi-month police lockdown, forensic teams were executing a meticulous, square-inch disassembly of the physical structure. They weren't just looking for traditional evidence. They were hunting for the hidden architecture of a psychopath's long-term preservation strategy. In the crawl spaces beneath the old workshop, behind panels of rotting drywall that had not been disturbed since the mid-1980s, technicians uncovered a series of hidden storage compartments containing vintage film canisters, handwritten ledgers with coded coordinates, and old keys that didn't match any lock on the property. Each discovery was logged with a cold, administrative precision, added to a growing mountain of evidence that painted a picture of a life lived entirely as a masterclass in psychological camouflage. The killer had used the very ordinary, boring materiality of suburban home renovation to bury the physical debris of his violence, turning his domestic space into a monument to his own survival. As the judge finally prepared to rule on the admissibility of the genetic genealogy data, a profound, heavy silence settled over the county. The entire legal battle of the last 3 months, the hundreds of pages of technical motions, the weeks of expert testimony, and the immense social friction that was tearing Blackwood Ridge apart, it all came down to a single judicial decision. If the DNA evidence was thrown out on a chain of custody technicality, the state's case would essentially collapse, leaving a 78-year-old suspect to walk free back into the community he had terrorized for 50 years. If it was admitted, the suspect would face a trial where his guilt was a mathematical certainty, a proceeding that would formalize his status as a historic monster and seal his fate for the remainder of his biological life. The town held its collective breath, the clock on the courtroom wall ticking with a loud, mechanical indifference that cut through the absolute tension of the room like a knife. The ruling, when it arrived, was delivered with the dry, monotone administrative clarity of a system that operates entirely on logic, devoid of human emotion or historical sentiment. The judge systematically denied every single one of the defense's technical motions, ruling that the chain of custody from 1979, while reflecting the primitive administrative standards of the era, had remained secure, and that the genetic genealogy match was an admissible form of scientific identification. The words fell into the courtroom like a sequence of heavy concrete blocks, sealing the exit doors for the defense strategy and setting a definitive date for the formal trial. In the gallery, Evelyn Cross's brother let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like the breaking of an ancient internal dam, his hands trembling as he stared at the back of the suspect's wheelchair. The legal maneuvering was over. The technical war had been won by the state, and the final, absolute confrontation between the town and its hidden monster was now an inescapable reality. The evening sun set behind the jagged, frozen ridges of the valley, casting a cold, purple twilight over the empty streets of Blackwood Ridge. The news of the judicial ruling rippled through the local networks within minutes, a digital shockwave that left the residents with a terrifying sense of immediacy. The trial was coming, the details were going to be read into the public record under oath, and the town would be forced to sit through a total, unvarnished presentation of the violence that had occurred in their midst in the winter of 1979. There was no longer any place to hide from the history. There was no longer any comfort to be found in the myth of the outsider or the passage of time. The genetic key had turned, the courtroom doors were locked, and Blackwood Ridge was now on a direct, collision course with a truth that would either finally purge the valley of its secrets or break its communal heart beyond any hope of repair. The formal opening statement of the trial did not arrive with a flourish of legal rhetoric. It dropped like a heavy pane of black iron onto the collective consciousness of Blackwood Ridge. By the morning of the first official day of State versus Cross, the temperature in the valley had plummeted into a bitter, biting frost, matching the clinical hostility that had taken complete possession of the county courthouse. The streets surrounding the judicial building were choked with police blockades, flashing blue cruisers, and a shifting, restless crowd of hundreds of citizens who could not secure a seat inside, but refused to leave the perimeter of the building. Inside the main courtroom, the air was entirely stagnant, smelling of old paper, wet wool coats, and the sharp, chemical tang of high-voltage television cables. When the prosecution stood to face the jury, the silence in the room became so deep that the faint, rhythmic ticking of the mechanical wall clock sounded like a countdown toward an execution. The assistant district attorney did not look at the notes on his podium. He looked directly into the eyes of the 12 jurors, his voice flat, rhythmic, and heavy with the absolute weight of a half-century of suppressed horror. In the winter of 1979, the prosecutor began, his words cutting through the tension like a scalpel through tissue. The people of Blackwood Ridge believed that safety was a right guaranteed by their fences, their pleasantries, and their silence. They believed that when 19-year-old Evelyn Cross walked down her driveway, she was stolen by an invisible phantom from the interstate. But for the next 47 years, that phantom did not run. That phantom did not hide in the shadows of a distant city. That phantom lived at 412 Maple Lane. He ate at your diners, he built your community center, he shook your hands at church, and he watched you cry for the girl he had strangled with her own winter scarf. The visceral impact of these opening words caused a simultaneous, physical shudder through the gallery, a collective intake of breath that sounded like water hitting a hot surface. The illusion of distance, the comforting myth of the outside monster that had protected the town's sanity for 5 decades, was systematically and permanently crushed within the first 3 minutes of the state's presentation. The prosecution's narrative quickly shifted from historical overview to a terrifying, second-by-second reconstruction of that Friday evening in November 1979. Utilizing massive digital screens that dominated the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom, the state presented a highly detailed, 3-dimensional topographic map of the Cross neighborhood as it existed 47 years prior. The jurors were taken on a slow, digital walk down the snowy asphalt path where Evelyn had taken her final steps, the screen highlighting the exact placement of the streetlights, the blind spots created by the neighbor's overgrown hedges, and the precise moment where her trajectory collided with the suspect's vehicle. The presentation was rich in graphic, devastating imagery, the frozen carton of milk lying in the pristine snow, the single, dropped mitten, and the complete absence of tire tracks, proving that the predator had carried her body across the asphalt to prevent leaving an automotive signature. The prosecution was stripping the case of its romanticized, true crime nostalgia, reducing the legendary disappearance to a raw, brutal sequence of physical mechanics executed by a young man who knew the town's blind spots better than the police did. As the state's opening statement progressed into its third hour, the defense table remained an absolute island of rigid, defensive isolation. The 78-year-old suspect sat slumped in his high-backed wheelchair, his head tilted forward, his eyes fixed on the green linoleum floor with a posture that suggested total, clinical detachment from the proceedings around him. He looked less like a historic predator and more like a fading specimen in a medical lab, his thin chest rising and falling in sync with the soft, mechanical hum of his portable oxygen concentrator. This physical frailty was the defense's primary, unstated shield, a visual appeal to the jury's natural aversion to punishing the elderly. But the prosecution counteracted this tactic by projecting a series of high-resolution, black-and-white photographs from 1979 onto the screen directly above the suspect's head. There, looking down at the courtroom, was the suspect at 21 years old, vibrant, broad-shouldered, muscular, with a sharp, arrogant jawline and eyes that possessed a cold, piercing intensity. The juxtaposition was a psychological masterstroke. It forced the jury to look past the liver spots, the wrinkles, and the trembling hands of the old man to see the powerful, patient wolf that had hunted the streets of Blackwood Ridge when the world was analog. The second day of testimony brought the first wave of human wreckage to the witness stand, beginning with the original responding officer from that freezing night in 1979, now a 74-year-old retired captain whose voice shook with the combined weight of age and systemic guilt. He sat in the wooden box, his hands gripping the edge of the rail as he recounted the sheer, chaotic incompetence of the initial 48 hours of the investigation. "We weren't looking for a neighbor," he admitted, his eyes downcast, refusing to look at the Cross family in the front row. "We were looking for a van with out-of-state plates. We didn't secure the perimeter because the snowstorm was coming in, and we thought the weather would preserve the tracks. We were wrong. We let the storm wash away the evidence, and we let the killer walk through the scene twice while we were setting up the search grid." This administrative autopsy of the past was agonizing to watch. It revealed that the cold case had not been an unsolvable riddle, but a tragedy of complacency, an investigation that had been choked in its infancy by the rigid, small-town belief that a local boy could never commit an act of absolute depravity. The cross-examination of the retired captain by the lead defense attorney was a masterclass in aggressive, scorched-earth litigation. The defense did not seek to defend the suspect's character. They sought to turn the entire history of the Blackwood Ridge Police Department into an unreliable farce. For 4 consecutive hours, the attorney hammered the witness on the primitive, unscientific storage methods used in the old county evidence locker during the late 70s and early 80s. He dragged out the original physical logbooks, highlighting missing initials, gaps in the timeline of custody, and instances where the blood-speckled winter scarf had been removed from its paper bag for public demonstrations or internal reviews without proper gloving protocols. "You stored this critical piece of fabric in a basement that flooded 3 times between 1982 and 1994, the defense attorney shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "You allowed retired officers, politicians, and reporters to handle this scarf with their bare hands for decades. And now you expect this jury to believe that the microscopic cells found on that fabric belonged to my client from 1979, and not to some contaminant introduced during 47 years of absolute structural neglect." The tension generated by this line of attack was a cold, physical presence that settled over the courtroom, causing an immediate, nervous realignment within the investigative task force sitting behind the prosecution's table. They knew that the defense was executing a highly effective strategy aimed at creating a reasonable doubt not out of innocence, but out of the natural, entropic decay of time. The passage of 47 years was the suspect's strongest ally. It had softened the memories of the witnesses, destroyed the original physical integrity of the crime scene, and left the state's case vulnerable to the argument that modern technology was simply reading a distorted, corrupted record. The prosecution needed a definitive, unassailable counterstrike to regain control of the narrative, and they delivered it on the 4th day of the trial by calling their star witness, the chief forensic geneticist of the state crime laboratory. The geneticist's entrance to the stand transformed the trial from a historical drama into a high-definition seminar on molecular architecture. She was a young woman with a calm, clinical demeanor that immediately lowered the emotional temperature of the room. Using a laser pointer and a series of massive, multicolored genetic charts, she explained to the jury how advanced negative-pressure DNA extraction techniques had allowed her team to isolate the suspect's profile from the deep, interior fibers of the scarf's knot, a location that had remained completely sealed away from external touch, moisture, and environmental contamination since the moment the knot was tied. "Surface contamination from handling is a reality," she stated, looking directly at the defense table. "But the cells we recovered were embedded within the internal weave of the wool, forced into the fabric under extreme mechanical pressure, the kind of pressure generated when a scarf is pulled tight around a human neck. This is not a profile left by a handshake or a careless detective in 1985. This is a biological signature left by the person who executed the physical act of strangulation." The mathematical presentation that followed was the final, crushing blow to the defense's technical strategy. The geneticists demonstrated that the likelihood of the DNA profile belonging to any other individual in the human population was 1 in 780 billion, a number so vast that it surpassed the total number of human beings who had ever existed on the planet since the dawn of time. The data was projected onto the screens in sharp, neon green bars, a visual representation of a scientific cage that was tightening around the suspect with an absolute, digital finality. To see the charts was to realize that the suspect's own cells had acted as an immortal, biological spy, carrying the secret of his violence through 47 years of changing seasons, political shifts, and technological revolutions, waiting until the world advanced far enough to read his true identity from the dust of his own crime. Outside the courthouse, the social decay within Blackwood Ridge had reached a level of total, paralyzing saturation. The town's daily commerce had completely broken down under the weight of the trial's daily revelations. The local high school, where the suspect had once been a regular fixture at athletic events and school board meetings, had canceled its spring track season, the administration unable to handle the constant, aggressive presence of true crime documentary crews that hovered near the sports fields, looking for B-roll footage of suburban isolation. The interpersonal trust that had survived for 50 years was completely gone, replaced by a cold, transactional skepticism that governed every neighborly interaction. If you stood in the aisle of the local grocery store, you no longer saw people chatting about their gardens or their grandchildren. You saw elders exchanging quick, defensive nods before moving away, their eyes filled with a silent, haunting question that had poisoned the valley. If he did it, who else among us has a grave in their past? The brother of Evelyn Cross had spent every single minute of the trial sitting in the exact same seat in the front row, a silent, human monument to the devastation that had been visited upon his family. He had stopped wearing his suit jacket, appearing now in a simple, dark flannel shirt, his face pale, his eyes surrounded by deep, dark circles from weeks of absolute sleeplessness. When the forensic geneticist described the mechanical pressure required to force the suspect's cells into the knot of the scarf, Evelyn's brother did not cry. He closed his eyes and gripped the wooden rail before him so tightly that his knuckles turned a sharp, bloodless white. In his mind, the walls of the modern courtroom had dissolved entirely, replaced by the perpetual, freezing darkness of that November night in 1990. He was no longer an adult witness to a legal proceeding. He was an 8-year-old boy sitting on the stairs of his family home, listening to his mother scream into the telephone as the realization settled over the house that Evelyn was never coming back. He was trapped in a state of chronological paralysis, a victim of a crime that had extended its execution over half a century, robbing him of his childhood, his family's peace, and his ability to ever look at a human face without looking for the teeth of a predator. The defense's presentation of their case began on the second week of the trial, and it was marked by a sudden, desperate shift in tactics that shocked the observers in the gallery. Recognizing that they could not defeat the mathematical certainty of the DNA match, the defense chose to lean completely into the suspect's medical history, calling a succession of geriatric neurologists and cognitive specialists to the stand. They attempted to establish that the 78-year-old man was suffering from advanced vascular dementia, an organic brain failure that had effectively erased his memories of the late 70s, rendering him mentally incompetent to assist in his own defense or to understand the nature of the charges against him. The man sitting before you today is not the man of 1979, the lead defense attorney argued, his hand resting on the suspect's frail shoulder. He is a shell, an invalid whose mind is a blank slate. To convict this broken elder for the actions of a young man who ceased to exist decades ago is not justice. It is vengeance wrapped in a scientific laboratory report. This argument introduced a dark, philosophical tension into the air of the courtroom, a cold current of debate that split the town's observers along generational lines. The older residents, exhausted by the relentless exposure and the destruction of their history, found themselves feeling a strange, uncomfortable flicker of pity for the frail figure in the wheelchair, wanting the trial to end so that the town could return to some semblance of quiet anonymity. But the younger generation of Blackwood Ridge, sitting in the back rows of the gallery and monitoring the case through digital live streams, rejected this medical defense with a fierce, uncompromising fury. They saw the dementia argument as the ultimate, systemic manifestation of suburban privilege, a final, cynical attempt to use the natural process of aging to escape the consequences of a lifetime of violent deception. They began posting independent research online, showing that the suspect had managed his construction business with sharp, financial precision up until 2 years before his arrest, proving that his cognitive failure had miraculously materialized only after the police knocked on his door with a DNA warrant. The prosecution's rebuttal to the medical defense was swift, clinical, and devastatingly effective. They did not call doctors. They called the suspect's own historic employees and subcontractors from the 1980s and 1990s. One by one, these men stood before the jury and described a man who was possessed of a hyper-organized, meticulous, and completely unyielding intellect. They described how he kept separate ledger books for every project, how he could remember the exact dimensions of a foundation he had poured 10 years prior, and how he possessed a terrifying ability to control his emotions under extreme stress. The state was constructing a psychological portrait of a master manipulator, an individual who had spent his entire life utilizing his high intelligence to maintain a double existence, an actor who had seamlessly transitioned from a midnight strangler to a daytime businessman without ever allowing a single crack to appear in his performance. The message to the jury was clear. The suspect's current silence was not a symptom of a failing brain. It was the final, tactical retreat of a lifelong predator who knew that his ordinary routines were no longer enough to save him from the light. As the trial reached its 15th day, the state introduced its final, most controversial piece of evidence, the leather-bound journal recovered from the hidden wall compartment of the suspect's workshop. The defense fought with savage intensity to keep the contents of the book from being read into the record, but the judge ruled that the passages directly relating to the geographic movements of the suspect in the winter of 1979 were admissible to establish intent and opportunity. The courtroom fell into a state of absolute, breathless paralysis as the prosecutor took the podium, holding a high-resolution photocopy of a page dated November 24, 1979. The ink was faded, written in a neat, precise drafting script that matched the suspect's architectural blueprints. The prosecutor began to read, his voice dropping an octave, echoing through the silent gallery like a sequence of heavy stones hitting water. "The snow is the best cleaner," the suspect had written less than 12 hours after Evelyn Cross vanished. "It covers the tracks, it slows the police, it keeps the neighbors inside their houses. They are all looking at the highway, looking for a ghost in a van because they cannot bear to look across the street. It is so simple to hide a thing when everyone is determined not to see it. The town is a perfect machine of ignorance, and I am the technician who runs it." The reading of this passage was the definitive, emotional climax of the trial. It was the suspect's own voice, preserved in ink for 47 years, mocking the very community that had protected him through its own desire for a frictionless, pleasant life. The words were a total, unvarnished confirmation of the town's worst fears. Their politeness had been his weapon, their privacy had been his cloak, and their collective innocence had been the very thing that allowed him to walk among them as an unpunished monster for a lifetime. The sun began to drop behind the sharp, gray ridges of the valley on the final day of testimony, casting a long, bruised shadow across the courthouse steps as the jury prepared to exit the room for their deliberations. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had delivered the answers. The trial had exposed the mechanics of the lie, and the leather-bound journal had revealed the black, hollow heart of the man who had broken Blackwood Ridge. But as the 12 jurors walked through the heavy wooden doors to seal the fate of the 78-year-old suspect, the atmosphere in the town center was not one of anticipation or hope. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a community that had been completely hollowed out by its own history. The truth had arrived late, cold, and heavy, and as the streetlights flickered to life in the winter twilight, illuminating the quiet, snowy paths where Evelyn Cross had once walked, the people of the valley knew that regardless of the verdict, the home they thought they knew was gone forever, replaced by a reality that they would have to learn to survive in, breath by breath, for the rest of their lives. The deliberation of the jury did not stretch across days of agonizing debate, nor did it require a complex, bureaucratic parsing of the forensic data. It was a swift, unyielding execution of logic that mirrored the clinical certainty of the molecular evidence. For less than 90 minutes, the 12 citizens sat behind the heavy, deadlocked doors of the jury room, their voices muted by thick walls, but their collective intent entirely clear to everyone waiting in the corridor outside. When the rhythmic, mechanical buzzer sounded to signal that a verdict had been reached, the sound sliced through the suffocating tension of the courthouse hallway like a razor blade through taut fabric. The rush to secure the remaining seats in the main gallery was a silent, frantic collision of bodies, reporters from global networks jostling past elderly residents who had spent 47 years holding their breath for this exact microsecond. The atmosphere inside the room had reached a state of absolute, hyperkinetic compression, the air tasting of ozone and old dust, the ambient light from the tall windows turning a weak, watery blue as the winter afternoon began its rapid descent into twilight. When the suspect was rolled back to his position at the defense table, his head remained bowed, his chin nearly resting on the plastic collar of his portable oxygen unit, his liver-spotted hands lying completely still in his lap like shed skin. He did not look at the jury box. He did not look at his defense attorneys. He simply existed in a state of profound, absolute isolation, a human vessel waiting for the legal system to formalize his eviction from society. The judge took the bench with a dry, administrative rustle of robes, her face a mask of judicial neutrality that gave no indication of the historic weight about to land on the record. As the foreperson stood to read the formal documentation, the silence in the courtroom became a physical weight, a pressure so intense that the soft, continuous click hiss of the suspect's oxygen machine sounded like an explosive charge detonating in slow motion. On the sole count of first-degree murder, the foreperson read, her voice tight, resonant, and entirely devoid of hesitation, we find the defendant, Arthur Penhaligon, guilty as charged. The word did not trigger an immediate outburst from the crowd. It landed with the heavy, dull thud of a stone dropped into wet clay. For several seconds, the gallery sat in a state of absolute, catatonic paralysis, the reality of the verdict requiring a moment to process through the decades of layers of suburban denial. Then, a low, collective exhale passed through the room, a sound like a sudden draft entering an ancient cave. In the front row, the brother of Evelyn Cross did not weep, he did not cheer, and he did not raise his fists in triumph. He simply closed his eyes, his pale forehead leaning forward until it touched the cold, polished wood of the gallery rail, his shoulders shaking with a silent, internal shattering that had been building since that Friday evening in November 1979. The 30-year cold case, the half-century of unpunished predation, the myth of the interstate phantom, it was all gone, dissolved in an instant by the definitive declaration of 12 ordinary citizens armed with a strand of DNA. The transition from the courtroom to the immediate aftermath of the verdict was a violent plunge into the meat grinder of the modern media apparatus. The moment the courtroom doors swung open, the hallway erupted into a chaotic, blinding circus of high-definition lenses, thrust microphones, and shouting reporters broadcasting live updates to a global audience that consumed the town's trauma as a digital spectacle. The authentic, slow-burning grief of the remaining survivors was instantly converted into a viral commodity, broken down into 10-second video loops, sensationalized headlines, and speculative internet threads optimized for maximum user engagement. The lead prosecutor stood on the courthouse steps, his face illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of television lights, attempting to frame the conviction as a triumph of modern science over time itself. But the residents of Blackwood Ridge, watching from the periphery of the police tape, could not find any sense of civic pride in his words. They knew that the verdict was not a cure for their town's disease. It was an autopsy report that confirmed how long they had lived with a monster in their midst. The physical dismantling of Arthur Penhaligon's life began the very next morning, executed with the cold, administrative precision of a bank liquidation. A task force of county sheriffs and state investigators descended upon the neat, white-shingled house at 412 Maple Lane, their yellow tape slicing through the quiet neighborhood like a physical scar. They weren't just looking for additional evidence to secure the conviction. They were executing a complete historical audit of a property that had functioned as a camouflage unit for 47 years. The local residents stood on their porches in the freezing morning air, their coffee mugs growing cold in their hands as they watched teams of technicians carry out plastic crates filled with the mundane, boring debris of a suburban existence: old golf clubs, garden hoses, family photo albums, and construction blueprints. The sheer normalcy of the items being loaded into the forensic vans was the most terrifying aspect of the scene. It demonstrated that the predator did not need a secret lair or a hidden fortress to survive. He had used the ordinary artifacts of middle-class respectability as his armor, turning the town's focus on material success into his most effective cloaking device. Deep within the structural marrow of the house, beneath the floors of the detached construction workshop where Penhaligon had spent his weekends, the forensic teams uncovered the physical manifestation of his double life. Behind a false wall of wood panels, hidden behind shelves of rusty nails and vintage power tools, they discovered a small, climate-controlled storage locker that had remained undisturbed since the late 1980s. Inside, preserved with the obsessive care of a museum curator, was the true archive of a psychopath's vanity. Dozens of detailed newspaper clippings tracking every anniversary of Evelyn Cross's disappearance, transcripts of police press conferences from the 1980s, and a collection of personal items that had vanished from the Cross home over the decades. This was the definitive proof of his hidden motive, the realization that his entire life after 1979 had been fueled by the hollow, narcissistic thrill of watching the town suffer while he functioned as their trusted neighbor, a predatory parasite that fed on the collective grief of the community he helped physically build. The social fallout from these discoveries hit Blackwood Ridge with the corrosive force of an acid spill, dissolving the remaining glue of interpersonal trust within the older generation. The Community Clearinghouse, which had been established to facilitate collective healing, rapidly devolved into an informal, paranoid audit of every neighborhood interaction from the last 47 years. If Penhaligon could sit at a block party in 1985, laughing with a beer in his hand while the school identification card of the girl he had murdered sat in a tin box less than 50 feet away, then who else was performing a part? Every long-standing friendship was suddenly subjected to a cold, retroactive investigation. Casual conversations from decades ago were dissected for hidden, sinister meanings, and a defensive, icy silence settled over the cul-de-sacs. The town was discovering that justice is a caustic agent. It does not heal the wound. It burns away the surrounding tissue, leaving behind a landscape so scarred that the original concept of community becomes an impossibility. The younger generation of the Valley, entirely unburdened by the nostalgic desire to protect the town's historical image, weaponized this social fracturing to force a total, institutional reckoning. Utilizing digital archives and public records requests, they constructed a highly detailed, open-source map that traced every single municipal contract, construction permit, and public funding allocation that had been awarded to Penhaligon's business between 1980 and 2010. They demonstrated that the local government had effectively funded the killer's comfortable retirement, utilizing taxpayer money to maintain the very property where the evidence of his violence was preserved. They flooded city council meetings with demands for a complete independent investigation into the historic corruption and complacency of the old power structures, turning the local governance into a battlefield between the defensive elders who wanted to bury the past and the cynical youth who demanded a total demolition of the suburban facade. The old detective who had first held the paper file in the winter of 1979 did not survive to see the final sentencing hearing. His heart gave out 3 weeks after the verdict was read, his body finally collapsing under the weight of the decades of silent, corrosive guilt he had carried through his retirement. He was buried in the local cemetery, less than 50 yards from the empty memorial stone that had been placed for Evelyn Cross in the early 80s, a final, proximity-based irony that did not escape the notice of the townspeople. His funeral was a sparse, quiet affair, attended only by a few aging contemporary officers who moved with a slow, heavy tread of men who knew their entire careers had been redefined by a single, catastrophic failure. They stood around the open grave in the freezing wind, their eyes fixed on the gray grass, realizing that their legacy was permanently tethered to the 47 years of silence that had allowed a monster to walk the streets of their jurisdiction with absolute, unbothered immunity. As the formal sentencing date approached in the late winter of 2026, the legal machinery of the state prepared for its final, clinical transaction. The defense attempted one last, desperate appeal based on the suspect's rapidly failing biology, presenting medical charts that showed his oxygen saturation levels were dropping and his cognitive functions were in a state of terminal collapse. They argued that sentencing a 78-year-old man with advanced vascular dementia to a maximum security prison was an act of performative cruelty, a bureaucratic exercise in vengeance that would serve no corrective purpose. But the prosecution counteracted this plea with an uncompromising, ironclad insistence on absolute accountability, presenting a series of victim impact statements that laid bare the total, generational destruction that Penhaligon had visited upon the valley since that snowy night in 1979. The sentencing hearing was a brief, somber event that lacked the high drama of the trial but possessed a cold, crushing weight that felt permanent. The judge did not read from a prepared speech. She looked directly at the frail figure slumped in the wheelchair before her, her voice dropping into a flat, rhythmic cadence that echoed off the high walls of the room. Arthur Penhaligon, she stated, the name sounding sharp and alien in the quiet space. You spent 47 years utilizing the decency, the politeness, and the silence of this community as a shield for your violence. You did not just steal the life of Evelyn Cross. You murdered the peace of an entire generation. The law cannot return the time you stole, but it can ensure that your remaining biological life is lived in the absolute, unyielding containment you earned. The sentence was natural life without the possibility of parole, delivered with a finality that closed the book on the legal proceeding but left the town to deal with the wreckage of the story. The physical removal of the suspect from the county jail to the state penitentiary was executed under the cover of darkness, a low-profile transport designed to avoid the remaining true crime live streamers who still hovered near the facility. As the heavily armored van moved down the highway, past the exit ramps that led back to Blackwood Ridge, the suspect looked out the small, reinforced window at the passing streetlights, his face an unreadable mask of age and clinical detachment. He was leaving the valley he had shaped, the community he had manipulated, and the home he had turned into a monument to his own survival, moving toward a concrete cell where his name would be reduced to a state identification number. His departure was a silent, unceremonious evaporation that mirrored the way Evelyn Cross had vanished from her driveway 47 years ago, a closing of the circle that offered no real warmth, no easy comfort, and no salvation for the people he left behind. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, the town of Blackwood Ridge entered a period of deep, exhausted stagnation, the circus of the media finally packing up its cameras and moving on to the next viral tragedy in another state. The sudden absence of the external noise left the valley in a state of quiet, echoing emptiness, the residents forced to look at their town without the distracting frame of a live trial. The streets looked exactly the same as they had in 1979. The same pine trees lined the ridges, the same streetlights flickered on in the winter twilight, the same wood smoke drifted from the chimneys, but the psychological reality of the space had been permanently altered. They were no longer the innocent, postcard-perfect suburb that had been victimized by an outside phantom. They were the town that had nurtured, protected, and funded a predator through its own desperate desire to keep its eyes closed to the dark. The property at 412 Maple Lane remained under a state-ordered lien, its windows boarded up with heavy sheets of plywood, its lawn growing wild and yellow beneath the melting snow. It had become a modern landmark of horror, a physical monument to the suburban lie that the residents could not avoid on their daily commutes. Parents driving their children to school would take long, convoluted detours through the back ridges to avoid passing the house, their eyes looking away from the intersection as if the very air surrounding the property were toxic. The physical structure was a reminder that the monster was not an anomaly that could be excised and forgotten. He was a product of their environment, an individual who had looked at their culture of politeness and privacy and realized it was the perfect environment to hide a crime. Evelyn Cross's brother spent the final months of the winter executing his own private ritual of resolution, completely detached from the ongoing civic debates about the town's future. He had purchased a small, native oak sapling from a nursery 2 counties away, and on a quiet, gray Sunday afternoon when the wind had finally died down, he walked down the empty driveway where his sister had taken her final steps 47 years ago. He did not ask for permission from the city council. He did not invite the remaining local reporters. He simply took a shovel and began digging into the hard, cold earth at the edge of the property line, his boots sinking into the wet mud as he worked the soil. He planted the tree in the exact spot where the frozen milk carton had been found in 1979, pressing the dirt down around the roots with his bare hands until the sapling stood straight and resilient against the winter horizon. As he stood back to look at the small tree, the silence that fell over the driveway was not the fearful, suffocating quiet of the cold case years. It was the heavy, peaceful silence of a truth that had finally been fully and completely spoken. The genetic breakthrough had delivered the answer, the legal system had executed its transaction, and the monster had been locked away in the dark. The tree was a living, breathing replacement for the phantom that had haunted his life, a marker that would grow year after year, utilizing the very soil that had held the secret to produce new leaves, new life, and a new history that was entirely free of deception. He let out a long, slow breath, the vapor clouding in the freezing air before vanishing into the wind, and for the first time since he was an 8-year-old boy, he turned his back on the driveway and walked away, without looking behind him. The sunset over Blackwood Ridge on that final evening of the unraveling was a violent blaze of orange and purple, the long shadows of the pine trees stretching across the valley like reaching fingers that no longer possessed the power to terrify. The town was still broken, its institutions were still fractured, and its older generation would carry the scars of their own blindness into their graves. But the long night that had begun in the winter of 1979 was finally, irrevocably over, its secrets dragged into the open, its silence shattered by the unyielding voice of forensic science. The residents of the valley lay in their beds as the darkness took complete possession of the ridge, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of their own breathing, knowing that the morning would bring no easy comfort, but knowing with an absolute, unyielding certainty that the light of the truth was finally, undeniably, the only thing left standing in the heart of their home. The entry of Arthur Penhaligon into the maximum security state penitentiary did not signify a clean resolution to the multi-generational trauma of Blackwood Ridge. Instead, it initiated the 6th phase of the valley's disintegration, the era of the structural autopsy. As the spring of 2026 began its slow, sluggish thaw, revealing the dead brown grass beneath the melting snowbanks, the town center felt less like a liberated community and more like an abandoned battlefield where the smoke had cleared only to expose the total destruction of the landscape. The true crime television crews had packed up their high-definition equipment, and the digital influencers had shifted their algorithms to a fresher, more immediate horror story in another state, leaving Blackwood Ridge to sit in an echoing, claustrophobic emptiness. The absence of external noise forced the residents to look directly at the physical structures they inhabited, realizing that every avenue, every municipal building, and every cul-de-sac was permanently linked to the infrastructure of a half-century deception. The focus of this 6th act shifted entirely from the perpetrator's modern biology to the historic complicity of the town's local institutions. The current county administration, under immense pressure from a cynical, digital native youth movement, was forced to open the Archive of Compliance, a comprehensive, public audit of every financial ledger, building permit, and public works contract awarded to Penhaligon's construction company between 1980 and 2015. This was a clinical, bureaucratic dissection of how a predator had managed to turn the civic pride of a small town into a highly lucrative enterprise. The documents, uploaded to an open-access digital portal, revealed a sickening pattern of systemic protection that was entirely financial in its nature. Penhaligon had not simply hidden from the law, he had built the very walls under which the law operated, using low-bid municipal contracts to embed his business into the literal physical security of the county. The revelation that hit the community with the most devastating impact was the library subcontract file from 1988. The archives demonstrated that while the original detective force was officially categorizing Evelyn Cross's file as an active, unsolved kidnapping, Arthur Penhaligon was being paid with public tax dollars to renovate the basement of the municipal library, the exact location where the historical archives of her disappearance were being stored. This level of extreme proximity was a psychological violation that the older generation could not navigate without a sense of absolute vertigo. It meant that while citizens were checking out books on community safety and attending local vigils on the ground floor, the predator was working directly beneath their feet, his tool belt jingling, his face familiar to every librarian, entirely protected by the bureaucratic armor of a valid city work order. Inside the local precinct, the task force was undergoing an internal crisis of identity, with the younger detectives realizing that the badge they wore was a historical artifact of systemic failure. The lead investigator spent his nights sitting in the basement evidence room, surrounded by digitized files that had been scrubbed of their analog errors but remained deeply disturbing in their historical reality. He began drafting an internal training manual titled The Camouflage of Normalcy, Lessons from the Penhaligon Failure, an analytical document designed to teach future academy recruits how to identify predatory actors who hide behind public philanthropy and infrastructure contracts. He realized that the system's greatest mistake had been its adherence to the profile, the rigid, outdated belief that a serial kidnapper must exist on the fringes of society, an assumption that allowed a highly intelligent contractor to utilize the very core of the community as his primary hideout. The physical landscape of Blackwood Ridge began to undergo a series of aggressive, desperate structural alterations as property values in the Central Valley collapsed under the weight of the historical exposure. The property at 412 Maple Lane, its white shingles turning a stained, industrial gray behind sheets of weathered plywood, became the focus of an intense municipal turf war. The neighboring families, unable to look out their windows without facing the physical monument to a 47-year lie, petitioned the city council for an immediate, total eminent domain demolition of the structure. They didn't want a park. They didn't want a memorial garden. They wanted a total, industrial extraction of the dirt itself, a literal removal of the geographic coordinates that had functioned as the command center for a psychopath's vanity. They were discovering that memory is an environmental hazard, an invisible radon that seeps up through the foundations of homes, poisoning the domestic stability of anyone who lives within its radius. The local economy, having flirted with the temporary, exploitative wealth of true crime tourism during the trial, collapsed into a stagnant, protective isolationism. The merchants on Main Street removed any references to the town's historical landmarks, attempting to rebrand the valley as a center for artisanal, sustainable agricultural commerce, but the effort felt hollow, a performative mask that could not hide the historic rot beneath the surface. If you entered the local hardware store, the silence was absolute, a heavy, transactional atmosphere where customers no longer exchanged casual advice about home improvement or lawn care. Every tool, every bag of concrete, every roll of industrial plastic sheeting was now viewed through a forensic lens, a reminder of the materials Penhaligon had used to construct the false wall panels and hidden storage units in his workshop. The material culture of suburban life had been weaponized against the community's sanity, turning ordinary home maintenance into an exercise in psychological distress. The Day of Vigilance, which had been held on the third Saturday of October for over 4 decades as a somber, performative ritual of communal mourning, was officially abolished by the City Council in the spring of 2026. The resolution was passed during a chaotic, late-night meeting that had dissolved into a bitter generational shouting match between the remaining members of the old guard and the aggressive, politically organized youth groups. The elders argued that canceling the vigil was an act of historical erasure, an abandonment of Evelyn Cross's memory that would allow the darkness to win. But the younger residents, led by local students who had archived every piece of the public records audit, rejected the ceremony with an absolute, unyielding cynicism. "You didn't hold a vigil to remember a girl," one student leader shouted from the podium, her voice echoing through the microphone. "You held a vigil to comfort yourselves for your own blindness. You light candles in the dark because you are too terrified to turn on the lights and look at who is standing next to you. The ceremony is over. The performance is finished. It's time to look at the bills we paid for his contracts. The theological fallout within the local church reached its absolute nadir during this period of institutional auditing. The pews, which had been packed during the tense weeks of the trial, were now mostly empty on Sunday mornings, the quiet space smelling of cold stone and old hymnals. The current pastor found himself unable to deliver sermons based on traditional concepts of collective grace or pastoral comfort. Every parable about a lost sheep or a hidden sin felt like a direct, accusatory indictment of the very building they were sitting in. The older parishioners who still attended sat with a rigid, defensive posture, their eyes fixed on the altar, refusing to look at the stained glass windows that had been cleaned and maintained by Penhaligon's maintenance crews in the late 1990s. The church had lost its status as a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. It had been revealed as a primary site of the killer's social engineering, a space where he had systematically used the language of faith to paralyze the natural instincts of his neighbors. Behind the concrete and steel walls of the maximum security state facility 300 miles away, Arthur Penhaligon was experiencing his own private biological dissolution, entirely detached from the institutional war he had triggered in the valley. The medical unit logs, which were filed weekly with the State Corrections Department, showed that his advanced vascular dementia had entered its terminal phase, his brain systematically shutting down the neural pathways that connected him to the physical world. He no longer recognized his name. He no longer understood the nature of the concrete walls around him. His existence was reduced to the continuous, mechanical hiss of an industrial ventilator and the blank, glassy stare of eyes that had outlived their capacity to perceive reality. This rapid cognitive collapse was a source of profound frustration for the modern investigative teams. They had won the legal battle. They had secured the life sentence, but the predator had escaped into the absolute sanctuary of his own neurological decay, leaving them to prosecute a shell while the true mind that had orchestrated the horror was entirely beyond their reach. For the brother of Evelyn Cross, the progression of this institutional autopsy was a process of total, absolute alienation from the town he had spent his life trying to preserve. He refused to participate in the public city council debates. He did not log into the digital portals displaying the construction contracts, and he systematically turned away any remaining independent journalists who knocked on his door. He found himself spending his days at the edge of the family property, his eyes fixed on the small oak sapling he had planted in the cold mud of the driveway. The tree had survived its first spring frost, its small green buds beginning to unfurl against the gray sky, a fragile biological witness that did not require a legal brief or a municipal permit to exist. In his mind, the town's sudden, aggressive rush toward political accountability was just another form of performance, a collective distraction designed to avoid the simple, quiet, and devastating reality of a single life that had been violently stolen 47 years ago. The physical terrain of Blackwood Ridge seemed to mirror this sense of stagnant, unyielding exhaustion as the summer of 2026 reached its peak. The heavy valley air was thick, humid, and constantly filled with the distant, mechanical hum of industrial earth movers working on a new highway expansion project 2 miles north, a project that had originally been planned and surveyed by Penhaligon's engineering firm in 2012. Every truck that moved through the valley, every orange construction barrel that lined the asphalt, every transit level that stood on a tripod was a reminder of his permanent, indelible influence on the geometry of their home. The town could not build its future without utilizing the blueprints of its executioner, a structural dependency that turned every sign of civic progress into a bittersweet reminder of their historical vulnerability. The final report of the public records audit was formally published by the county controller on a hot, breathless Tuesday afternoon in August, a massive 300-page digital document that laid bare the final, definitive accounting of the Penhaligon era. The report demonstrated that over a 35-year period, Arthur Penhaligon had been paid over $7 million in public funds for infrastructure development, structural maintenance, and civic design. The document concluded with a cold, administrative statement that functioned as the final epitaph for the town's historic innocence. The success of the subject's evasion was not a function of forensic luck or environmental intervention. It was the direct result of a structural integration wherein the subject utilized ordinary civic commerce to achieve absolute social immunity within the victim's own jurisdiction. The publication of the report did not trigger a fresh wave of public demonstrations or angry council meetings. It was met with a deep, collective silence that settled over Blackwood Ridge like a heavy winter fog. The data was too precise, the financial lines too clear, the complicity too systemic for anyone to argue against. The older generation sat in their homes, the digital screens of their computers illuminating their pale, tired faces as they scrolled through the lists of checks, permits, and board approvals that bore their own signatures alongside the killer's name. They realized, with a finality that left no room for legal defense or psychological escape, that they had not been a community that was visited by an outside evil. They were the community that had built the house where the evil lived, paid the utilities, and maintained the lawn for half a century, while the truth lay buried in the dark fibers of a forgotten scarf. As the night took possession of the valley, the streetlights flickered to life along Maple Lane, casting their cold, yellow glare over the wild grass of number 412. The plywood on the windows creaked softly in the evening breeze, a low, structural sigh from a house that was waiting for its eventual, inevitable demolition. The residents of Blackwood Ridge lay in their beds, the windows open to catch the humid night air, listening to the continuous, distant hum of the highway traffic in the distance. The genetic key had unlocked the case, the courtroom had delivered the verdict, and the institutional audit had exposed the architecture of the lie. The long night that had begun in the winter of 1979 was over, leaving behind a community that had been completely dismantled by its own history, a town that would have to learn how to exist in the cold, unyielding light of a reality that could never be unlearned, together, in the open, and for the rest of their biological lives. The autumn of 2026 descended upon Blackwood Ridge, not with the vibrant, golden hues of a traditional changing season, but with the flat, oppressive gray of a permanent twilight, ushering in the seventh phase of the town's historical unraveling, the era of the physical extraction. The publication of the institutional audit had left the community in a state of total structural paralysis, a silent grid of households that had finally run out of legal defenses, medical excuses, and psychological distractions. The town knew exactly what it was now. It had seen the line item checks, the public works contracts, and the blueprint approvals that bore the dual signatures of their elected officials and a midnight strangler. But knowledge is a volatile, heavy element, and by the time the October frost began to crystallize on the window panes of Main Street, the collective demand of the valley shifted from bureaucratic accountability to a visceral, desperate need for literal, physical erasure. They had dissected the papers, they had jailed the body, and now they wanted to tear down the walls that had hosted the lie for 47 years. The epicenter of this collective obsession was the immediate, unyielding mobilization for the demolition of 412 Maple Lane. The city council, desperate to salvage some shred of authority from the wreckage of the public audit, fast-tracked an extraordinary eminent domain resolution, bypassing the traditional multi-month zoning reviews and environmental impact assessments that usually govern municipal property liquidation. The neighborhood could no longer endure the physical presence of the structure. It sat behind its weathered plywood barricades like an active, emitting source of psychological radiation, a monument to a half-century performance of middle-class virtue that had hidden an absolute depravity. On the morning the extraction was scheduled to begin, a crowd of hundreds of residents gathered along the perimeter of the yellow police tape, their breath forming dense, silent clouds of vapor in the freezing October air, their eyes fixed on the heavy, industrial yellow high-reach excavators that stood on the dead grass like predatory insects, waiting for a signal. The extraction was not handled as a standard construction demolition. It was executed with the meticulous, defensive precision of a hazardous material containment operation. The engineering firm hired by the county had to construct an artificial negative pressure containment tent over the rear workshop, the exact location where the false wall panels and the hidden trophy locker had been discovered 3 months prior. The technicians moved around the property in bright white protective suits, their full-face respirators humming with a continuous, mechanical drone that cut through the silent valley air. They were treating the material culture of Arthur Penhaligon's domestic life as a biohazard, a literal toxic deposit that had to be systematically cataloged, bagged, and shipped to a high-security industrial landfill 3 counties away to prevent any lingering contamination of the local soil. To watch the white-suited figures move through the skeleton of the house was to witness the total, uncompromising eviction of an entire era of suburban folklore by the clinical machinery of modern sanitation. When the massive hydraulic jaw of the excavator finally tore into the roofline of the primary residence, the sound of splintering pine beams and shattering plaster echoed off the surrounding ridges like a sequence of low-level acoustic detonations. The crowd did not cheer. The silence along the police tape remained absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Every crack of breaking wood was a physical strike against the memory of their own blindness, a literal destruction of the pleasant, deceptive facade they had spent 47 years cultivating at the expense of Evelyn Cross's life. As the excavator systematically reduced the structure to a chaotic heap of raw gray dust, twisted metal wires, and broken concrete foundations, the older residents stood completely motionless, their hands buried deep in the pockets of their winter coats. They were watching the physical erasure of the house where they had attended holiday dinners, the lawn where their children had played, and the address they had trusted, realizing that no amount of industrial demolition could ever reach into the past and scrub the historical blood from their own hands. By the 3rd day of the operation, the primary structures had been completely leveled, leaving nothing behind but an expansive, raw crater of dark, frozen mud where the foundations had been violently ripped from the earth. But the community's demand for extraction did not stop at the floorboards. The county controller's office, operating under a mandate from the student-led task force, ordered a deep geological core sampling of the entire half-acre lot. Rumors had continued to bleed through the digital networks, unsubstantiated but terrifying whispers that the suspect's construction business logs from the early 1980s contained unexplained discrepancies in concrete allocations for his own property, hints that the ground beneath the workshop might hold more than just forgotten tools and vintage film canisters. The arrival of a truck-mounted drilling rig transformed the demolition site into an active archaeological survey, the rhythmic, mechanical thud-thud-thud of the diamond-tipped drill bit cutting deep into the bedrock of the valley, a sound that kept the entire neighborhood awake for 72 consecutive hours. The analysis of the geological core samples was conducted in real time inside a mobile laboratory unit parked at the edge of the property line, its exhaust pipes sputtering constant plumes of white smoke into the cold air. The forensic geologists scoured the density readouts and chemical signatures of the deep soil layers, looking for any anomalies that would indicate historical excavation or the presence of hidden, secondary deposits. The tension inside the local precinct reached a state of absolute, white-knuckled saturation during those 3 days. The current detectives knew that if the drill rigs uncovered a secondary scene, the Oakhaven cold case breakthrough would expand into a regional structural disaster that would permanently destroy the legal and social framework of the entire county. The result of the survey, when it was finally delivered to the district attorney on a gray Friday afternoon, was a negative readout. The deep ground was solid, undisturbed, and chemically consistent, a biological relief that did not, however, lift the psychological weight that was actively